Speaking of taste, I think when I was reading through your book to prepare this, I was very impressed. I dig it.
Oh my God, phew.
I think
I
we
think
have
that
a
I
lot of
was,
similarities in terms of the styles as well.
yeah, shoot me over some of your stuff because I'd love to read. I'm sure we'll get into a conversation about it, but I think that again, when I got a DM from Heavy Board, I think I've been obsessed with Berryman in different ways I feel like my relationship with him has changed, but he's always still been a real linchpin for me over like the past 15 years. So I
Oh
think I was
yeah,
so thrilled to get a kind of message from Heavy Board, and I was like, yes. Also,
life changing.
I love your music, the music that you
Oh,
have. That
thank
was
you.
the Berryman. I think that that's sick.
Yeah, I did. I spent a lot of time making that, but with putting like the custom kind of Berryman readings into the.
It's so good. I actually, his recordings, I think, are some of the most fun things to watch. I think because whenever I show somebody Berryman for the first time, I think obviously you start with Dream Song 14, but I think that I'm always like, I'm going to read it to you, and then you have to watch the video of him reading it because it'll change so much of how you're kind of intoning it in your head.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
I, u- I used to date somebody who was able to do the perfect drunk Berryman impression of like the sort of like just in terms of the weird timings and kind of stilted ways in which he kind of puts the scissor and that really kind of confuses you. I think that's the one thing I miss about that relationship, really, and nothing else.
Yeah, I mean Berryman. We'll get into this. Yeah, absolutely life changing. Discovering that for the first time and just the boundary breaking that happened in that collect in those the first 77 and then the regiment like all those 300 dream
Yeah.
songs. It just the I always say because yeah, I'm a huge fan. People ask me about him if I do other podcasts or something, and I'm just like, I think like in my personal opinion, that is the most innovative work of poetry
Yeah.
we've had like since like
Yeah.
nobody's come close to being able
Mhm.
to do what he did with that. And it's just and people there's all kinds of criticisms of it, but I'm just listen to it, just read it out
Yeah.
loud, and just
Did
brilliance.
you have you read what Elizabeth Bishop said of it in a letter to Robert Lowell, which is I think that she said something like it doesn't make any sense, but in 50 years it's going to be the most important thing that's come out of our generation.
Yeah.
And I think that she had this sort of prophetic idea of like I think what he's doing with syntax and again like very high and low culture combined, I think is just still mind-bending to look at.
Are you a Bishop fan?
Bishop took a bit longer for me. I think that I do love her.
Me
I actually
too.
think that
Yeah.
she is amazing. I think that she's one of those poets who I find I did a course on her, and I think I found her really, really difficult to actually write essays about because I think in some ways her poetry is so perfect and smooth.
Yeah.
It's almost like writing about Blake, where I think that if I'm going to write about Lowell or someone, there's quirks there's scaffolding. I felt like I was almost with Bishop climbing up a glass wall
Yeah.
because it's so kind of considered. And I think that that's amazing, but I think can really make it almost academically difficult to have to engage with.
That's 100%. I agree with everything you said. Yeah. I think she's one of the best that ever lived to do it. And I'm obsessed with her. And like The Fish is one that I'll give students and stuff. Just,
Oh
I think
yeah.
it's a perfect poem, kind of like, and yeah, she's unbelievable. And then, yeah, her attitude, like her letters and stuff, just what you see. And
Oh my
oh,
God.
it's,
I think that I have her all of her letters to Robert Lowell. I think I just love I carry them around with me whenever I have like a flight or like a long train journey just because like one they're so amusingly bitchy to each other, which I love because poets are secretly very bitchy people. But I think that she has such a keen eye. Like I think there's some yeah, she has an incredibly keen eye and I love her attitude. I mean, this is a more controversial thing, but I think refusing to be in women's only anthologies I think is really interesting and something that I respect a
especially at the
lot.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of distancing herself from the kind of women's liberation movement, especially just in terms of her poetry as a lesbian as well, I think is so interesting. So yeah, really fuck with her.
Oh,
Can I?
yeah.
I can swear on the
Oh
podcast,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Anything goes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Okay,
no
cool.
rules. Anything
So,
goes. Any crazy idea, even we'll talk about it here. That's what I want the podcast to be. Like, I want it to be. This is where I always say like when I originally started it, I wanted it to be. This is the conversation that people have after the course, in grad
mm,
school at the bar, where they say what they really think. Not
yeah,
to appease your teacher or not to just hold your tongue because you don't want to get into it with this annoying person
yeah,
in the cohort or whatever, but just what you really think. And I just Yeah. So yeah, anything goes. You can swear,
Awesome,
bring up
amazing.
crazy shit, yeah, crazy stories, any of that. It's all fair
Yay,
game.
brilliant.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
This is Andrew Wittstadt, and you are listening to Heavy Bored. And we're recording this on January 12th, 2024. My guest today is the poet Sarah Fletcher, a writer whose attitude and command of the craft comes across in stylish and flashy ways. Her work is inventive, refreshing, interested in pushing the boundaries, the limits of the craft. Her work speaks for itself, listeners, and the ambition is on the page. She was called a poet of the future by Michael Dickman, which was my favorite of the blurbs for her debut poetry collection, Plus Ultra, which came out in the spring of 2023 from Cheerio Publishing, and, of course, is linked in the description of this episode, listeners. The style is impressive. I can't seem to get away from that word. The sheer ambition that she is able to scale and mount onto the page is nothing short of impressive. There's that word again, listeners. Sarah's been compared to poets like Plath and Sexton, and there's a sheer ballsiness to the work. The confessional aspect that aims to push boundaries and lay things bare. Sarah Fletcher is a poet who you will be hearing more of in the future, listeners. I have no doubt. One of the co-founders of the Dead Women Poets Society in 2015 and named a Foyle Young Poet of the Year in 2012, Sarah has also previously published 3 other pamphlets of poetry: Kissing Angles from 2015, Dead Ink Press; Typhoid August, my favorite of the titles, from 2018, and Caviar from 2022 from Outspoken Press. She obtained a master's in poetry from Royal Holloway in London and is currently working on her PhD at Aberystwyth University, where she also teaches. I first came across Sarah on Twitter, of all places, where so many different factions and worlds collide together. She was Berryman posting, and it caught my eye, which of course earned a follow immediately from me, listeners, as it always does, and it made me reach out to invite her onto Heavy Bored to bring her particular approach to poetry to all of you out there. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on to chat.
Oh my gosh, Andrew. Well, I'm so pleased that you've invited me. And I think, again, I think Twitter is a kind of amazing space, because I think that the moment that I saw that I was messaged by Heavy Bored, of course, I immediately was psyched by the Berryman reference. And I think before I even clicked to see what is this podcast about, what am I agreeing to, I immediately was just like, yes, 1,000,000%, I want to be involved. So I'm obviously really, really pleased to be here today. Thank you for inviting me, Andrew.
Of course. As I said, I had to. I felt like I had to. As soon as I saw that, I was like, oh yes. Yeah, I mean, Berryman, we've already chatted a little bit about it in preparing for this, like just how important it was. And I like that you said that you were intrigued even before you were afraid, because there's people that I've asked, to come on the podcast, and when you're doing things like this, you're always cold emailing, cold DMing, you never met anybody, and like Sarah and I have never met until now, listeners, and it's, it sometimes people like be a little turned off by it, like, sometimes when anything goes on a podcast, people will be like, oh, I don't know. I don't want to embarrass myself, but I appreciate you coming, willing to risk it for coming on.
It's kind of interesting, because I think that I think especially when you were kind of referencing kind of confessional things earlier, I feel like a willingness to almost be embarrassed, I think, is something that actually is at the heart of quite a lot of writing. And I think that I feel like if you have an attitude of being a bit too cool for school, I think that having that disclosure in which it could be brilliant, but it could also be deeply embarrassing. I think that's often where some kind of heart or energy or at least urgency enters a poem, when it's actually there seems to be something at stake, and it could be something, I guess, less kind of intense than public humiliation. But I think that that is indeed something that often kind of plays a role. And I feel a bit like with poets, if we're going to take up space on a blank page, you have to have the kind of balls to want to be embarrassed a bit. You don't want to be, but I think it's something that you risk. So I think that I'll see how the podcast goes. Of course, everybody worries with the anything goes approach. Will it be successful or not? But I think that I feel like I already have the kind of embarrassment at stake quite happily.
I love that. I love that. And it's true. It's the vulnerability, especially when you're doing confessional kind of aspect poetry. You know, you're not just doing very formal, you know, pretty nature poems. You know, you are opening up to the world, and you're doing it in a refined way, you know, because you're doing it through poetry and stuff, and then podcasting is a little different. But yeah, I think that's 100%.
It's interesting. I wonder with, I think especially when we're talking about vulnerability and confessionalism, I think that's something people often get wrong about thinking about a phrase like confessional, is that I think that they really assume it's about the content itself. And I think that a lot of people, I think, conflate confessionalism with you're going to somehow be talking about the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or really getting into kind of dark topics or very taboo topics or sexual topics. And I think that more so than a lot of the content, I think it is about the sort of vulnerability and what's at stake. I think, especially with a poet like Anne Sexton, I look at a lot of her work and I think that she's not really confessing things necessarily. She's telling us things to shock us in some ways. And I think that she's kind of implicating us in an almost flirtatious relationship. But I don't think that she has this element of shame or confessionalism necessarily. She's a poet who writes about sort of taboo things. And I think that there's a kind of interesting distinction there between confessionalism almost as a sort of attitude towards vulnerability and excavation versus, I guess, a sort of way in which you kind of put real life events into verse.
That's incredibly interesting. In the way you said it with Sexton, there is this kind of almost sex appeal in the verse, but it's not quite like sexual confession, but it still has this, and partly because she was so gorgeous and blah, 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 but it's also
Well, I wrote this, I think my undergraduate dissertation, I think was about Sexton's use of the word you. And I think that what I love is that I think that the you is often a lover or someone like that, but you as a reader become very implicated in the you. And I think that what she often does is that she kind of exposes herself and then is speaking to you. And I think that you almost feel like, if I don't think this is a poem, I'm somehow rejecting her sexually. And I think that it's a really smart trick, though, that she does, because I think that there's almost this sort of weird high stakes flirtation or striptease of reveal versus not reveal versus is this true? Are you turned on by this? Maybe you shouldn't be. Maybe this is horrible. And I think that is a kind of interesting way of working with, reader expectations. And I think that, of course, the fact that she was gorgeous in some ways allows that sort of relationship to happen. I think that one of my favorite stories is that I think her most famous poem is Her Kind, which I love. And I think that she used to open every reading with it and say, this sort of poem will tell you what type of poet I am first, and then secondly, what sort of woman I am. And then she would read it, which I think is like for most of her career. And I think that I find that ballsy and insane, yet not confessional.
Right. That's incredible. Yeah. And I want to get to that now. We're already going all these different places that I'm so fascinated. I want to keep going, but I did want to interview you and showcase you here. So I always like to start this off with just kind of more intimate questions. Whereas, what was your childhood like? And I know that's a very broad question, and I always try to gear it towards, to narrow it down, so we're not just having a whole hour on your childhood. It's just how that led you to writing.
Should I like lie on the couch on my back?
You don't have to get that into it. You don't have to be that detailed. Yeah, you could as detailed or as vague as you want with any of this. But yeah, you're growing up and how that led you to literature, how that led you to becoming a reader and a writer, and then eventually, poetry. Was it always something you did? Is it something you come later in life? Yeah, all those.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I feel particularly lucky because I think that I've had a kind of self-identity as a writer, I think probably from a very young age. A story that my mum loves to tell is that she says that when she found out she was going to have a girl, that an angel came down and kissed her on the lips and said, "Your daughter is going to be a famous writer." So I, so I think that that was a lot of, in some ways, the kind of, and I'm really lucky that I actually love writing. I think it would have been really awkward if I happened to want to be a mathematician or something. But I think that I'm pretty lucky that I think that my parents always, I think I was always loving to read. And I think I was always, I think, a bit of a professional noticer or a detail collector. And I think that that's a kind of particularly maybe writerly trait. I think I remember loads, my grandma who sadly has passed away was, I think, one of the first women to get a PhD in Alabama. And so she was like hard as rocks, amazing woman from the South who did a lot of cool things with civil rights activism. But she gave me the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam, the translation by Edward Fitzgerald, and a collected copy of, I think, all of the collected of Anne Sexton, I think when I was about 12. And I think that those two in combination exploded my mind. And I think that, of course, I think that I was always writing, and I think that my mom, I'm quite lucky, we would get in kind of fights, and I don't think she'd mind me saying this, because I think that when I was a kid, I was always writing poems, and I'd just give them to her, and my mom, because she took me seriously as a writer, would be like, "You know this is a lazy line." She wouldn't be like, "Oh, wow, I have a precocious daughter who's writing these poems." It'd be, "You know what? Why don't we work on this metaphor? What does it actually mean to do this?" And I think that, I remember once, I think my dad came in while we were getting in a particularly heated editorial row, and he was like, "Wow, I would never want to speak to you again if like somebody'd spoken about my work that way." And I had to stop and be like, "No, I kind of love this. I think that this is a sign that she's giving it respect and taking it seriously."
Yeah.
So I think that I got my first poem published when I was 14 in the London Magazine. And I'm really pleased. This is such a shilly thing to say, but I won second place in their short story competition this year. So I think that it's exciting to still be, I guess, still in the old haunts, even 15 years later. But I think, I think I started submitting properly when I was 17. And I think that I won a few youth competitions. I always joke that I won the Foyle Young Poets competition, and there's quite a few of us around. I almost feel like we need a group similar to AA, where you can be like, I was a former Foyle Young poet, and it's like, and for some reason I was told that I can make a living off of art when I was a kid,
right.
and now we're all poor and live in London, and have vague emotional issues. But I think that I'm pretty lucky that I think that I was always really interested in literature specifically. I mean, I imagine most writers, or at least a lot of my writer friends, you go through a brief teenage period where you're like, I'm going to be a rock star instead. So I think I definitely had a stint where I was like, fuck this, I'm going to write lyrics now. Also, I can definitely sing. Right. I cannot sing. So I think that that was a lot of the background. And I think I was lucky to have had quite supportive teachers and kind of imbibing influences, despite the fact that, of course, I was probably one of the most angsty teenagers ever because I moved around a lot. So
you're a millennial, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, angsty millennial, like it goes hand in hand. Yeah.
I know, and I think that it's funny because I think that my brother is a Zoomer, and I think that our attitudes, because he was not. Of course, all teenagers have a rebellious period, but I don't think he had angst. I think angst is a very kind of specific sort of thing to have. And I think I still actually feel like I'm an angsty adult, which I think is probably one of the less appealing things to be. But
but you said you do both fiction and poetry?
Yeah, so I mean, gosh, I'll whinge about this eventually. I'm writing a novel, which is one of the worst fucking ideas I've ever had, because I'm 65,000 words deep, and it's like, it's an entirely different approach to writing. Yeah. I mean, I think that I only started writing fiction, though, in the past 2 years. I think, obviously, as a child, we all write stories. But I think that there was something very specific about poetry that attracted me. And I think that I remember, this is such a funny and almost embarrassing thing to say on a podcast. I think when I was like 11 or 10 years old, I had a really big crush on this one guy. Shout out Chase Clemens, who will never listen to this. I think he would, but he was kind of like a popular guy. Obviously, I was a bit of a weird girl, and I gave him a poem that I'd written, which was like called My Will, and it was like, if I were to die tomorrow, I'd tear out my heart, give it to you, and pray that you'd become a different person. And I gave it to him thinking it would be like a nice romantic thing. Of course, it's not a cool thing for a 10-year-old to do.
Right.
I think teachers were like, that's kind of mean. But I think that I probably liked the concision and the sort of intensity that poetry can afford you. And I think that was probably something that I was kind of gravitating towards.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I like when writers do both too, because I think there's something about poetry where you said this condensed form, it is the most difficult form in a lot of ways, where you have to do so much condensing, and then it's more than just condensing, because when you're doing long form fiction, you can just be writing paragraphs and paragraphs, and it doesn't matter where the line ends, it doesn't matter how it kind of goes full circle. I mean, it does in terms of plotting and other things, but it's related. But I always say, like, if you study poetry, it makes you better writing at fiction, nonfiction, all these other forms of writing, because poetry is this kind of the highest form of kind of word art, I guess you could, if we want to call it that,
Well, I'm intrigued because I think I heard you say in another podcast that you're writing a novel at the moment.
Oh, yes.
And I think I can tell that's a distressed novelist. Oh, yes. That's how I feel. That's how I feel. I think that it is interesting, though, to see. I think that when I first started approaching my novel, I think that I almost had to train myself out of quite a lot of poetic impulses that I have, which are, for example, editing a lot as I go. Or I think that my supervisor, who I showed some of it to, was like, Sarah, this is incredibly dense. It's so dense that I feel like I need almost line breaks to take in what is happening. You know that you are allowed to kind of expand and go on a tangent. And I think that because poetry operates so differently, I think it took me a long time to actually give myself some permission to be able to sort of be like, okay, actually, this is a form that breathes in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, I like that. And I always blame, I mean, I don't know why this happened, but I don't know if I'm just being like rose-colored glasses or what, but like, I always felt like it used to be much more connected, where I always kind of blame like the MFA system, where they say, oh, you pick poetry or fiction, you can't do, but there's always some overlap where you can take courses, but you have to declare whether you're doing poetry or fiction or nonfiction and stuff, even in PhD level stuff. And I'm like, okay, so they're kind of forcing you to go one way or the other, when it's like you should be doing all of it together because it's so connected. And it makes you better, a better reader, a better writer when you do it all together. But then you have
I just feel like writing as a species is something that is useful if we are able to kind of obviously integrate with all the taxonomies within it. I think that I find it very mad that there's almost a sort of hyper focus, especially where I think that I know loads of novelists who don't read any poetry at all, or just don't know anything about poetry or the history of poetry. And I'm sure that we can say the same about poets who really don't actually read a lot of prose or know even just what kind of conversations are happening within that kind of particular canon. And I think that it is a shame to just writing as a discipline, to see it again in this sort of mono way, especially when I think historically that's not really been how writing has worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you said you have an interesting history where you said you're a British American. You have dual citizenship, both continents here. Tell listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think that I grew up in New York, Connecticut, and Illinois, and I think I was interested in writing then, but I think that when I moved to London, I was about 13, and I think that I really started writing in a more as serious as you can be as a teenager way there. I think that I kind of briefly mentioned to you before, I think that it is kind of interesting in terms of influence, because I think that I feel quite lucky that there's a quite ripe tradition of the American moving and relocating to the UK. I was going to say, obviously the first one is T.S. Eliot. I was going to be like, and Ezra Pound, but I feel like maybe that's better to shh on at the moment. So I'm not good. I'm not like Ezra Pound, but I think, I think something that I do find intriguing is that when in terms of the kind of duality there, is that I find the poets that are read, especially in MFA courses in America, are entirely different. And there's not really a conversation between a lot of British poets and American poets at all. I think that we've had more success with poets like Dennis Smith and Kaveh Akbar being published in the UK and having a lot of success. But I think that there's actually two separate kind of cultural conversations happening with poetry between the two continents. And I think I find that kind of intriguing. I think that, especially because I read both and want to sort of, obviously everybody seeks to be a bridge in some way,
Right.
A bridge that they will end up burning. But I think that, yeah, that always specifically intrigues me, how much I feel like there's a kind of lack of cultural exchange happening when I think historically there's been so much similarities between the two. I mean, I guess obviously the elephant in the room of an American poet who moved to England is Plath, who I share a birthday with, actually.
Really?
Isn't that the spookiest shit ever?
Yeah,
I think that that's like my party fact. If I want to freak people out, I think that, and also Dylan Thomas, actually, it's a good birthday for writers.
Yeah.
I guess dead writers.
At least one.
I'm very much alive.
The ones that have done something. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, the ones who you're interested, I think that they're often, it's kind of funny, Dylan Thomas and Sylvia Plath, they're kind of the writers who you read when you're 16 and you're like, yes, I like this.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways they become I think that they can often become a bit passé in some circles. There's this amazing test I took online, which is it a Dylan Thomas line or the name of a heavy metal band? I think that some of it is like intense cacophony, can kind of lend itself to that reading of it. But I think that, yeah, they're the goats. You read them when you're a teenager and are like, poetry's kind of cool. Yeah. And then you like grow up and you're like, damn, this is so not cool. This is not fun. But I think that, yeah.
And you, I always like to ask, what were some of the first poets, writers, even expand it beyond poets, that you were enamored with, or who, like, your kind of go-to inspirations or idols in the literary world?
So I think if I'm thinking back to when I was around 16, I think it's always funny. There's something I read online, which is almost like your music taste really solidifies by the time you're 17. And I think that a lot of the bands that you end up really loving are the bands that you love when you're 17.
Oh, yes.
And I think that that's so true for me as well. But I think with poets as well, I think that I remember at that time imbibing a very kind of healthy diet of, I think actually Percy Shelley, if I'm going to name drop someone older. I think I remember reading The Wasteland in high school, and the teacher started it off with, "You guys are not going to understand this poem." And I just said, I do. Yeah. I think that I do. I don't think it's that incomprehensible. I think that I really, really fucked with The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. And I think I still go back to that. Of course, Prufrock is the teenage, like, right, incel love. I think that I was reading a lot of that in Yeats. But I think that really, I remember, I think when I got into Berryman, who I think that we both have in common, oh, yes, I think that I had the huge dream songs, the 77 and then the rest, all in this one thing. And I think I lugged it across. I like had it almost as like a pet dog with me at all times, like on a bit of a dinky leash of like some stupid purse I had. Right. And I think that it's just amazing for dipping in and out of. And I think that every time I opened it, I felt like it was a kind of, I don't know, like a portal into something quite creepy or menacing or exciting and ecstatic. I think that there's so much to be found in there. And I think that Berryman, as well as I think obviously like massive soft spot for Lowell as well. I think that those are people who really got me into things. I think also, to name drop someone older, I think that when I was at university, I had a poster on my wall of the poem "They Flee From Me" by Thomas Wyatt, which is a like pre-Renaissance poem, essentially about being an old man that girls don't want to fuck anymore. I don't really know as a like sexy 19-year-old what I was manifesting with having that on my dorm wall. Whatever it did, it probably didn't work. But I think that I feel like there's a sort of tentativeness with how he plays with meter. I think what I especially like to link it to Berryman as well is I think being able to know the kind of rules of prosody and then thinking, well, how can I fuck this up, or how can the syntax be weird? And I think that obviously poetry, you have to focus a lot on rhythm and things like that. what does it mean to have it be disjointed in this purposeful way? Or what does it mean then to kind of slice a perfect iambic line in the middle of that? I think that that sort of control was something that I think I was always interested in, especially with my early influences.
That is fantastic. Yeah, and I love the way you put it with this kind of the control and then this kind of like the subversion of the expectation and stuff, the way writers like Berryman would do that with the dream songs and stuff, and even Lowell. Yeah, I mean Lowell is such a towering figure in poetry, and I know he's American mostly, but I mean just what a figure. And when you read that stuff, like it is so complex, like especially I mean the confessional stuff is less complex than his earlier stuff, you know. I'm thinking of
I think Lord Weary's Castle is really underrated. I think his early stuff like slaps, and I think also like is really, really good.
And it's people, they don't, because it takes more work to appreciate Lowell's early stuff than it does the confessional stuff with his later, you know, life studies in the 60s there. But it's like people are like, oh, that's too difficult, but it's like that is masterful. You know, there's a reason that he's a towering figure in literature in both continents, yeah, the British and American kind of scene. It's just because, I mean, who is going to put that much work into it anymore? Who's putting that much work into that kind of rhyme scheme for that long, you know?
You'd love that there's this letter, and I'm sorry, I think
No.
I'm the worst for interrupting, and I think that
please.
I know it's, I think especially on a podcast, I feel like it's one of I think the Zoom era was very hard for me emotionally because I used to get excited. But I think that you'd love this, which is that there's a hilarious letter that Robert Lowell writes John Berryman before they'd met in person, and he says, "We have so many things in common. I am's ... wife ... wives ? And I think that there's this sort of I'm using, I think, metrical bravado that manifests probably in their marriages as well, hopefully, who knows. But I think that that I find really intriguing. I think especially with a lot of early Lowell, I think that there is, because I think that Lowell is someone who I think I actually have the biggest soft spot for. I think especially, I mean, his early stuff is amazing. That poem, The Dolphin, though, where it's like, my eyes have seen what my hands have done, that like fucks me up. And it's such, like, when I read that, I'm like, oh my gosh, I just love that. And I think that he has this sort of, I think that he's able to get away with a lot of the stuff in life studies because he's been so learned, and again, from this kind of Boston Brahmin background, and has like really been able to sort of like imbibe the classics, and like obviously he has the Ovid translations and things like that. There's so much that's going into it that I think makes it interesting, and I think that we kind of forget that a lot of that was required for him to be able to write something like life studies.
Yeah, absolutely, and like because he was doing it so long too. But you talked about music too, and you said even in your teen years you had kind of a period where like you kind of went away from writing, and then it was more music and like trying to be in bands and sing and write lyrics. And was music a big part of bringing you back into poetry? Because I like hearing that with writers, because it was for me, like music was the gateway into, and lyrics and stuff was the gateway to serious poetry study and like engagement when I was in my late teens, early 20s into college. And I was just curious if you had any of that, or...
Were you a big Bob Dylan fan?
I'm not a huge Bob Dylan fan.
No, neither am I.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. I want to kind of, I guess I'm intrigued by who were the...
I'm a millennial, so emo music was big. Emo lyrics, and I know that's not the best poetry if we're going to try and make the comparison.
Fall Out Boy was the first concert I saw. So
which one? Sorry?
I saw Fall Out Boy.
Oh, okay,
I know that they're
perfect.
Not technically emo. I like a lot of old school emo, like Rites of Spring. And I guess Fugazi aren't quite emo, but things like that, I think that I fucked quite heavily with.
Yeah,
so.
Love Fugazi. And then it was always like Taking Back Sunday was big. That was a very big one. And then even when I was younger, I mean, things like Green Day, something like that, where people, I mean, they're not as good now, but I mean, their heyday in the 90s, and I was too young to be listening to them when they were releasing things like Dookie, you know, to the public. I didn't listen till years later, but those lyrics are great. And then when I got more serious about that, I got into like indie rock, and like Modest Mouse is one of my favorites in terms of lyrics. And I know, you know, he always loved, Isaac Rock loved the Silver Jews. He loved these kind of the songwriters that like and like Dylan, like I'm not a huge Dylan fan, but I can respect, you know, why
Yeah.
he's so big and why, you know, some of those lyrics are fantastic, very
Yeah,
good.
well, with Dylan, I brought it up as well because Adrienne Rich has this essay where she says that the only two writers who seem to be working in Americanese are Bob Dylan and John Berryman, which I think that that's something though that I still find a bit of a baffling thing to have said. That I think that I often ask, I mean, the few writer friends that I still kind of actively surround myself with, I'm like, but what do we think she meant by that?
Right.
What, like, does it have to do with the phrasing? Does it have to do with the weird metaphor? What's happening?
What do
But
you think she meant by that? If you
I
had to
don't know.
guess, you know, we don't need
So
definitive
if I had to
answers.
guess,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'd probably say somewhere. I think that something that is amazing about Berryman is just kind of strange caesures and line breaks and syntactical splicing. And I think that often when I listen to Dylan, it takes a while for a whole phrase to complete. I'm not a huge Dylan fan, to be
Yes.
honest. I think also they might maybe in some ways have similar kind of ways in which they're kind of working with the kind of mythic whilst combining it with the kind of mundane Americanism. And I think, again, not shying away from slang, from the blues tradition, especially with Berryman as well.
Oh yes.
But yeah, I think to veer randomly back, which is, I guess, a bit of a thing to the music thing, is that I think that that's something I think that embarrassingly enough, because I think that well, I shouldn't be embarrassed by it, but I was a huge Nirvana fan as a kid.
Yes.
I
Oh
think
yeah.
that
Kurt
changed my
Cobain,
life.
very
I
important.
know. But then more controversially, I got really into Hole and Courtney Love. So I think that I think was something that I think Hole and I think Tori Amos as well. I think that they are people who I think lyrically, I don't think I'm necessarily under that influence, but I think that it was a sort of sound that was angry or kind of
Oh
abrasive,
yes.
but that I think that I was like, how could I do that with words?
Yeah.
I think that I was more interested in almost capturing the vibe, and that made me intrigued more so than I'm focusing on the lyrics. It was listening to that and being like, I don't know if I've read something that has given me this feeling. And so I
Right.
want to try to read something that's going to give me this feeling. And how could I write something that can somehow capture a feeling of abjection and anger, but also with self-hatred and vulnerability? There's quite a lot going on there with Nirvana as well. And so I think that that kind of massively brought me back.
And the lyrics, the Kurt Cobain lyrics, I'm not gonna say that they're poetry, right? But I'm just gonna, they're so, like the Lithium. Like when I first
Yeah,
started
it's
getting
such a
into
good
that,
song.
that lyric to Lithium is like they're so good. I mean, not just the music quality too. Where I said Nirvana's the only band that could have an entire chorus of just the word "yeah" over and over
Yeah.
again. But like
Well, also,
that,
when we were talking about embarrassment earlier, I think that the line in Lithium where it's like, I'm so horny. And I
right,
think that that's something that's a kind of throwaway line, but I think that that's something where it's like, if you're trying to write a cool dude rock song,
right,
you don't put that line in. This is something that's actually kind of vulnerable or on the edge a bit because like nobody really wants to go around being like, I'm so horny, that's
right,
okay. I've shaved my head or like, and so are you. It's kind of crazy. So
yeah.
I think that that kind of separates it in terms of vulnerability from a lot of the cock rock stuff that happens at the time.
Absolutely. And like that was new too, like where it was just off of like kind of the hair metal of the 80s with the makeup and the kind of big hairspray and 5 minute guitar solos. And then Nirvana comes out of Seattle with
Yeah.
this kind of, yeah, I'm so ugly, but that's okay because so are you know, and we broke
Yeah.
our mirrors. Yeah, I'm so horny, but that's okay. My will is good. Like kind of
Yeah,
the
that's it.
drums,
It's so good.
like it just,
I
yeah,
think also kind of royalty is I think
yes,
such a good like lyrical triumph where I think that
absolutely.
like I think and I love the kind of nod to the lyrical king, I guess Leonard Cohen in it, which is like give me a Leonard Cohen afterworld so I can sigh eternally. I think there's something again an amusing homage, which is like this is a kind of quite self-loathing song in which he's talking about having to take like medicine for his stomach pain, like on cherry antacids, while somehow kind of putting himself in conversation with one of the kings of writing kind of romantic song lyrics in some
Yeah.
ways. And I think that that's something that I think I really liked a lot as a vibe. And I think that I wanted kind of how can poetry then be operating in that similar sort of way?
Yeah.
I think that rebellion in poetry, I think that a lot of people who are seen as kind of rebellious, you either end up with sort of, I don't know, like this sort of like poets who Damn. See, I'm already into the podcast and I don't want to say things that will get me in trouble.
No,
But I think that I think there's like the sort of poets who just like do almost like word art. And I think that that's one way of rebelling. And I think that we've almost had these kind of dual ways of rebelling, which is either I'm going to see how dark I can get it and I'm going to confess things that are so autobiographical, or I'm going to almost do this sort of nonsense word art. And I think that those are both things that for me felt personally unsatisfactory at kind of capturing the urgency or interest of especially a lot of the music that made me think like, wow, this is making me feel something, but it's also making me think a lot too. There's this T.S. Eliot quote where he says, great poetry can communicate before it's understood. And I think I've really had that as a sort of compass through most of my writing, where I want to be able to communicate something and then you can go back and understand it in maybe some kind of intellectual way. But I feel like there's either too much communicating or too much understanding going on.
Yeah.
And I think that more synthesis happening.
That's a very interesting way to think about it. And it's making me, I didn't prepare for this, but I'm thinking of it now with this kind of, there's kind of something wrapped up, and I think Plath, Sexton, I'd throw Ginsberg in there. I'd throw some of the the poets that people get into when they're first getting into poetry. Frank O'Hara I like to throw in there as well. And then there's kind of wrapped up in these lyricists too, with Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Jim Morrison. At that time period,
I love the Doors.
I love the Doors. I know, I'm not a huge fan. I'm not a fan of his poetry, but I love I like the Doors as well. Yeah.
When I was like, when I was like 12 years old, I think that all the girls had like posters of Justin Bieber on their locker, and I had like dead Jim Morrison with his shirt
with
off.
the shirtless,
that famous one, and that was like who when I was 12, I was like, yeah, I like him.
Oh yeah,
that's like I'm like I don't like Justin Bieber. I like this random drug addicted man.
But I think you put your finger on it
through my life as an adult. So,
yeah,
what?
And I think, but you put I think you put your finger on it where you said with this the thing that all of those artists kind of have in common and why they kind of circle around this poetry thing is because it says that Eliot quote where it implies meaning, and even some of these lyrics, Nirvana and stuff, imply meaning before you understand them. Like, people always give him Nirvana shit for like Smells Like Teen Spirit. The lyrics are kind of nonsense in a lot of ways, but then it conveys that feeling without you having to understand the chorus. It's just the shouting, a mosquito, my libido, like this kind of rhyming and giving you that feeling without making sense. And there is that kind of, maybe that's why when we're just getting into poetry and things, before we take it, to the academic levels where we're getting masters and PhDs, we're enamored with these artists that are, like you said, trying to do poetry in a way that's like rock stars, like kind of. I had a friend when we were younger and in college, undergrad, getting into poetry, took workshops together, and she would always say this question to me. She was like, how do you poetry like Banksy? Like, that's what she would say, where like make a statement and make people see it, make people see it and kind of be loud, kind of that rock music style. And I don't know, everybody has their feelings on Banksy or whatever, but just that time when I was an undergrad, he was blowing up. Like Exit Through the Gift Shop was huge. Everybody wanted Banksy stuff. He was, the biggest artist in the world at the time. And, it was cool. It was cool. I know some of people are like, oh, it's cheesy now. And some of it is, but like a lot of it still holds up. Like a lot of it is cool. And it was very simple. It was very stripped. It was, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
No, it's funny because Banksy, I think, is an interesting person to bring up because I think that so this is an incredibly rude question to ask. How old are you?
I'm 34.
You're 34. I'm 29. And so I think that I thought Banksy, was a bit passe, but I actually lived in Bristol, where Banksy is from.
Right.
And I think there's loads of original Banksys around Bristol. And I think that he's really part of the Bristol environment. So when I was briefly living there, it really gave me a kind of renewed sense, actually, of like, you know what? I'm not too cool for school for this. I actually think a lot of this is actually kind of sick. And I think that I'm not going to, it's almost in the same way that like, I've really had a renaissance with my appreciation of Allen Ginsberg, where I'm like, no, maybe these things that we liked as teens are actually good.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I think I can see that. I do wonder who the poetry equivalent to Banksy would be.
Yeah, I don't know if there is. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there is one.
Yeah, I wonder, do you know Harold Pinter at all? I think that the playwright, but he wrote this horrible poem, I think, for some kind of like public event for the Crown that was just making really liberal use of swear words. And I wonder if that could be it. I don't even know enough about it for it to be an interesting story. But I guess something that I also was thinking about in terms of how thinking about Nirvana and thinking about these bands, which is that a lot of the things don't make sense, but it's how they say them.
Yeah.
And I think it reminded me a bit of, do you know what is one of the Berryman poems where it says like, it's doing a blues stanza or something where it's like, I've been so lonely, haven't seen my son, or something like that. And I think he's really working. It's very simple, but I think for me, it's one of the saddest poems that he's written. And I think that, again, it's because it's not necessarily the content, what he's saying, but I think that it's the intonations where I think that, again, that's what kind of makes it powerful.
And I think you do this great in your work too. Like, this is what I was drawn to, where you are the short one word sentences, and they work, they rhyme even, and then a long sentence that is extending the line off the page, and that putting them together does create like an urgency, like a kind of almost rock music. I don't, we don't want to go that far with it, but like I really
don't go that far with it. I don't care.
Yeah.
Well, I think actually it's interesting. I'd like to ask, what do you think about Frederick Seidel?
Never read, never heard.
Oh my God. No. So Frederick Seidel, I think he's an American poet. Funnily enough, I have a copy of his book over there. He won a poetry competition for a collection that Robert Lowell judged, I think in the late 60s. And the title of the collection was Final Solution. What a dickhead. He's such a dickhead. But I think that he has this almost very vulgar, clunky, like line breaks, where I think that he has this almost hackneyed rhyme. So I think that what he often does is like, there's this great poem of his called Cunnilingus, which has a phrase like, my face is falling off my face, which I love. But I think he has a lot of things that are really willfully offensive, like a woman my age, like a naked woman my age is a nightmare. And I think that he plays into, though, being a massively rich dickhead with this most hackneyed end line. And I think that when we were thinking about what is kind of rebellious to say in the context of contemporary poetry, I think him actually being like, yeah, I'm a gross old man who fucks young women and like lives in a like penthouse in Manhattan and has like studied so much, and like I'm just gonna have these almost offensively simple rhymes. I think that I almost feel like is kind of, there's something, I mean, I don't want to be a dickhead and say a word like punk, but I think that there's something that has a sort of aggressive, like, I feel like it's like 3 chords, angry, doing something like that. And I think that because of that, I actually really like it, even though I imagine, obviously the feminists don't like him. So.
Yeah. Well, I think punk, are you a punk fan at all? Like,
oh, a huge punk fan.
That was very important to me as a kid. Yeah. Like, and there was kind of a punk revival when we were growing up as millennials too, I guess in America and the UK, where you have like kind of the original punk UK bands, like with the Clash, like the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, weren't they British or were they?
Oh my God, the Buzzcocks are so British. Yeah. Love the Buzzcocks. I think that is funny actually, because I think that the first punk band though that I really got into, which is again, I feel like was the Ramones, but I think that they're almost like early Beatles with distortion. Like I feel like I could see the Ramones doing I Want to Hold Your Hand with distortion. And I think there's actually something so almost earnest about the Ramones, because they're not edgy in the way that some of the other ones are necessarily in terms of their song structures or even lyrical content. But I think
even the Sex Pistols were like super fucking just the shows, like the cutting themselves on stage.
You know
like
what I hate actually is that I think that a lot of punk fans love to kind of peacock by being like, you know what, the Sex Pistols kind of suck. And I'm like, you know what? I like the Sex Pistols. I think the Sex Pistols are good. I think Submission and Pretty Vacant, those are great tunes. I like those. I think that I'm not too cool for the Sex Pistols. Yeah. I don't care that they were made to sell clothes. Sid Vicious did literally die, guys. Like, they have cred.
God Save the Queen. Like people are like, oh, it's their biggest song. I'm like, it's fucking great. Have you listened to that song?
Exactly. Like, I think, especially with the monarchy at the time and kind of Thatcherite Britain, I think that was a cool thing to have done. But no, I think I really fucked with them. I think I got really into, do you like any post-punk stuff like Gang of Four or like, I think that, or even like Talking Heads, like new wave stuff. I think that I got really into. I think actually Stop Making Sense is an ethos I quite like in terms of a kind of poetic thing, because I think that obviously, I think there's this kind of, again, I think that it ties back to things that we've been saying about expression and wanting for things to be, again, communicated before they're understood. So
Yeah.
I think that a lot of that stuff I really fucked with.
Yeah. And that was a huge deal. Like it was at that time. So when we were growing up, you go into Walmart. I know this is basically American, I guess, but like you go into Walmart, they were selling Sex Pistols T-shirts. They were selling like Dead
Yeah.
Kennedys T-shirts. They were selling Ramones T-shirts at
Yeah.
Walmart. It was like this huge revival that was happening, and all these teenagers that were like, I was like 13, 14,
Yeah.
getting into this and listening to all these records from the 70s and 80s and 90s, and then just like. Yeah, I think that's a huge influence over our entire generation. Like,
Yeah.
like just,
It's kind of interesting because I think that you kind of mentioned the word emo earlier. And
yeah,
I think
yes,
that when
please. I
when
love
I was,
talking emo. Yeah.
well, because I think that when I was in school, I think that because I was more into grunge, I think that I have to say, bless my parents, I made them listen to so much bad music from when I was a teenager. But I think because I was really fucking with Hole then, and I still love Hole.
Yeah.
I think that I was like, I'm not emo, I'm a kinder whore. And like not knowing that the entire like premise of that style is that you're supposed to be an adult woman dressing like a kind of little girl. If you're actually 14, it like looks probably kind of perverted and not great. But I think that I remember I kind of had beef with some of the emos because I felt like the emos, I was like,
They were like
you know
pansy,
what?
right? Little pansy.
I was like the popular kids think I'm like you. Like I was really into, swans? So they're like really horrible to listen to. I don't even recommend them. But it's like one of those things where I'm like, you think that's heavy? Do you want to listen to just like dissonant noise of a man? Like, do you know Suicide? They're kind of similar to Suicide, like dissonant noise of a man having a breakdown. And I'm like, this is what I like. You guys are just emo kids. Like, oh, what? You straighten your hair? And then I was
Right.
like, well, I actually do have no friends now, except for like my English teachers. But
Yeah.
I think that it was kind of interesting because I think that emo, I've always said, I guess maybe hipster after that is one of the last real subcultures. When I teach my students now, because I teach undergraduates, something that I think is really interesting is that I feel like they don't seem to have a sort of style or a band or things
Yeah.
like that, or just even a vibe that they organize themselves around.
Right.
There's almost a kind of course, if I'm teaching creative writing, it's almost like a kind of potpourri of weirdos, which I think, again, is wonderful in its own way. But I think that I was quite lucky that I think during our generation, I think that we were able to kind of have a bit of a subculture to tune into, or I felt like there was
Yeah.
something where I'm like, okay, I might not be cool in school, but there is something else outside of there that I'm kind of tuning into that I'm really appreciating. And I think that a lot of that has kind of been lost now.
Of course. Yeah. I think you're 100% correct. And I don't like to blame like Gen Z and the younger generations. I think a lot of it wasn't their fault. A lot of it was like social media kind of destroyed cultural subcultures, or they made them so fractured and niche that they're hard to find,
Yeah. I mean,
But yeah.
this is me being, I think that I can say this. I mean, that I find really interesting is that I've had a really distinct relationship between, I think that I taught kids who were about 16, 17 during the pandemic.
Right.
They were generally pretty well adjusted and they were okay. And I think that that was a good teaching experience. I think that when I taught kids who were 14, 15 during the pandemic, and those are the top angst years, I think I noticed in class a kind of definitely noticeable difference between their ability to stay focused. And I think that being on their phones, and I think that it's kind of interesting because I think that I went to one student and I was like, are you taking notes on your phone? And she was like, no, but this is how I need to listen.
Right.
And I think that the thing is that I don't think that she was trying to, I don't think that she was taking the piss. I think that she was right. I think that she probably did need that extra stimulation to be able to listen to what I was saying. I don't think that it was her fault. I think that there's been this kind of reward culture in which almost you kind of need this, I don't know, so many different kind of channels of media happening at the same time to be able to kind of process things. And I think that that's intriguing and sinister to me in equal measure. I think that we're probably the last generation that remembers life before the internet.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's, people dismiss that as a very important marker in not just culturally, but how everything kind of functions now too, how even higher ed and classrooms function now. It's around this social media, when you're, especially with teaching, I teach at a community college here, and it's when you're especially during that online time during the pandemic, where everything changed in terms of everything was social media. So even like those kind of Canvas, or at least the ones we use in the US are like Canvas or like Blackboard or like these kind of
I
online
use Canvas
things.
and Blackboard.
Like those are like they're like becoming social media. They're becoming news feeds where you scroll and you can see all the like
Yeah.
it's very interesting how that's changing everything, and people are like dismissing it because we're too close to it maybe to like analyze it as like this is a big shift, not just culturally but like how we used to do things, and it's affecting things, even affecting the art, even if however minor, how we create, how we publish, how we do all of these things, how we podcast, and we can chat. Like you can chat with you over in London while I'm over here in the US, and we can have these kind of connections, which is the great thing about it. But then there's like the negative side too, where everything's
it's so interesting because I think that obviously like something. So I was talking to a friend recently because I'm writing this stupid novel, but I was saying that for me to be able to write, I really actually have to do it freehand. I can't write on a screen.
I love that.
And so my friend was saying, so you're telling me that you've written this entire novel down in different bits and you type it up. That seems time consuming. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing.
Right.
I actually, how I interact with the screen at the moment, I see it as work or doom scrolling.
Yes.
I think that the ability to be creative, like on a screen, I think is incredibly different for me. And I think that generally, I think that especially because when I go through a writing process, I think that, I don't know how poems start for you, but I think that for me, I think that I generally write, I think that they don't happen linearly. So I think that I usually write something in the center of a page. And then I think that I start to kind of have different things offshooting from that and expand on those. And then at some point, I know what order to put them in. And I think it's a very weird process, but it's not a process that I can replicate on just text edit or notes. And I think that is kind of intriguing, the kind of, ramifications that this has for creativity, because I think that it is kind of crazy.
100%. And I love that you say that, and that's your routine, and that's your kind of process. I love that you do it away from the screen, particularly when you're doing long form writing. Like for me, especially experimenting with fiction, I would always do poetry, handwritten. First drafts are always handwritten, and my that's just the way I like to do it. But then, sometimes I'll do that with fiction too, but it's just easier to do it on the screen right away because you're just doing so many lines if you're doing a couple pages a day or whatever. But then I like that you're refusing to, or even as you said, not even just like not even that deep. Like it's not like you're like, oh, I'm not doing this. It's just a matter of this is what works for you. And sometimes you find that screen to create a barrier between your ideas and the expression. I think that's so important, and that's something that I think a lot of writers and artists, some are grappling with it now, but I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be even more people trying to grapple with this kind of, this addiction to screens and this constant, everything's on screens, all your work is on screens, everything when you're doing the kind of knowledge jobs, like it's
well, I think that I saw some meme like earlier a few days ago that was like, so I was at work and I looked at this one screen, but then I had some breaks where I looked at my small screen, and then I went home and I looked at the good screen, and I think that I think that it's so obvious to be like, oh, screen's bad. But I do think that in some ways it is a kind of excess of stimulation. I think that's something that I've started to do. I think I started doing this a few years ago. Is that I think that I started to really try to get into classical music because I think I really wanted to train myself to listen to something with no distractions and be able to kind of appreciate something that is long form in its own way without getting kind of bored. Because I think that obviously I listen to my own music, but I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna start to listen to a 10-minute prelude for something, and I just want to actually see what that experience is like. And it's almost kind of like going to the gym in terms of getting endurance for something. And I think that what I really disliked is, I've done that with music. I think that I find it frustrating with often even reading novels where I'm like, I really want to be able to savor something like that and not have that kind of distraction. Like I think that I've been reading, do you know The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann?
Oh yes.
Oh my God, amazing. But I think that that's a heavy book. And I think that when I first kind of started approaching it, I was almost like, I want to get to the end. And I think that I've almost tried to kind of cognitively work with myself. So I'm actually just really enjoying the process of reading. I mean, I think actually this ties a lot with what we've been saying about poetry, where I think that a lot of poetry, I think, is important because I think that it really forces you to focus on the process of reading. And the attention itself is something that you have to give to it. I think something with a lot of my students, I think that they'll be like, well, what was this poem about? Or what was it the point? And I feel like those, again, are often the wrong question. I think that what's supposed to happen is that it's not, if you could do it too long, didn't read, you shouldn't write the fucking poem.
Right.
the poem itself is a process. Like, I think, especially if we're thinking about like sonnet, the volta, you are going through a kind of cognitive and emotional process with the writer that I think is something that requires attention and a kind of emphasis on reading and line break in itself that I find interesting to focus on. And I think that that makes it different. Like, I think I read something online that said, at the moment in history, we're probably reading more than anybody in the world has done in terms of just looking at things on a screen,
Right.
reading a menu, reading stop signs. I'm looking around my room and I can read 20 different things if I wanted to that are just like there strewn about. And I think that actually forced, like what poetry can do, which I think is really amazing, is that it really forces you to kind of think about what is actually happening when I'm making this strange visual connection between myself and the screen or myself and the book. And I think that that sort of attention that it requires, I think, makes it a kind of more prescient art form than we might imagine.
Yeah, and how intentional, right? The intentionality, for lack of a better word, like poets or poetry is the intentions of each of these words in this specific order to create that kind of reaction or feeling. And so much of what we're reading all the time, like you said, we're surrounded by it, is so unintentional. Like it's just people firing off tweets, or it's people putting up a passive aggressive sign in the, in a hallway or whatever, and you're like, it's less that this intentionality. Whereas anybody can do this, but you have to kind of, the intention is what makes it almost more of an art form, like the intentional arrangement. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
No, I agree. I think it's kind of funny. I mean, so I don't know where I'm going with all of this. I'm spitballing as well. I think it's kind of interesting. I think that I was speaking about somebody about like love languages, which is one of those stupid things where I think that apparently love languages was actually conceived by like a massive Christian evangelical in like a pro-Christian sort of thing. But I think that they were saying that now actually attention, which is actually not really a love language, but intentionality should be almost something that's added. And I think that the idea with poetry that I think that you're going to kind of gift it a very specific attention, I think is a kind of act of love as a reader and something that you hope somebody will do as a writer. I think that I feel like there's quite a lot of lazy verse that I think rewards not being able to pay attention to it. And I think the kind of idea of like, again, it's communicating something. Like I think that I think this is a struggle often with political verse, but I think that this happens with a lot of things where I think that I often wonder, why did this have to be a poem? I ask this a lot to my students where I say, so you're choosing to write this as a poem. That's great. I love poems. Right. But I think that what is it that makes poetry uniquely special to kind of communicate what you want to do with it? Because I feel like why are you, like, you should ask yourself, why is this not a story? Or why is this not a diary entry? Or why is this not even a tweet? I think that you should really kind of be intentional about poetry itself being the kind of most useful form for this to take. And I think that something that really influenced my poetry, I think the most, was I think that I was in a, I think that, how old was I? I was like 21. I think I just moved to London. I think that my parents won't listen to the podcast, so I can probably say things. So I think that I was kind of like hanging out with these two other older poets, and I was on speed. And I think that they said something that really hurt my feelings, which was that they said, Sarah, I think that your poetry expresses something, but I think that our poetry creates new thoughts and does philosophy. And at that time, I was like, fuck you guys. That's that was so wounding. And I think that since then, I think that I've had a kind of underdog obsession with the idea that, of course, the point of poetry in some ways is to kind of have an element of expression. But also, I think even with plus ultra as a title, which is Latin for further beyond, I want there to be like, well, actually, you can think in different ways. I think that that's what's exciting about it. Like when I read some Berryman poems, I'm like, I've never thought about this in a specific way, and it actually is genuinely something that's challenging. And I think that that's something that I feel like poetry is very uniquely suited to do, especially because philosophers are awful at communicating their ideas. Most of the time that we say that they're hard, it's because they're bad writers. Right.
Yeah, and it gets kind of convoluted, and there's all these exceptions they have to kind of go over. And then, when poetry lets you kind of make the idea cleaner, I don't know if that's the right word.
Like a good example of this is, do you fuck with Wallace Stevens at all?
Yeah.
I think Wallace Stevens is a really good example of it. 'Cause I think that Wallace Stevens I used to find quite cold and difficult in
He
some
is.
ways.
He's a
And I
little
think that
cold. Yeah.
I think that when I started seeing him as an erotic poet, I think that I like my imagination opened up to him, and I think that in some ways he is very sensual. And I
Yeah.
think that there's something that I read, which is I think that he's one of the modernists who one didn't go to the UK. Did you know that he once punched Hemingway in the chest?
No.
That's like my favorite story is that they were in Florida and he punched Hemingway in the chest, which I think makes him a Chad in general. But I think that he was one of the modernists who didn't go to the UK, and I think he was one of the modernists who was an atheist and didn't believe in God, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that because obviously the rest went through their own batshit conversions,
Yates.
which I have sympathy to. So,
Yeah.
I love, you know what? Yates, I always say, is the incel laureate. I think that, like,
I love
I
that.
actually,
Yeah.
I fucking love Yates. Well, you know,
You started your book with it. Yeah.
yeah, I think, so the line, the tragedy of, what is it? The tragedy of sexual intercourse is the perpetual virginity of the soul. There's a funny story there, which is, I think that he was in love with Maud Gonne, obviously. And I think that he'd been in love with her for 20 years and they finally consummated. And I think that he almost had like erectile dysfunction. He was drunk in a
Right.
hotel in Paris and it wasn't great. And he said that to someone at the pub. But I remember I've always been obsessed with that line. And I think that I was tweeting it once. And my boyfriend at the time said, Sarah, I'd really appreciate it if you stopped tweeting that. Because, like, it's not making me look great. Like, can you tweet? Like, I know that, like, it's not about me, but I think the fact that you seem to really be connecting with this is making me seem a bit impotent to everyone else. So,
Absolutely. I always say that is it's understudied reason, especially for some of those older Hemingway and stuff, like in the erectile dysfunction years for
oh,
adult
yeah.
men is underused in terms of like explaining that either that can make a man very angry, that can make a man very depressed and want to put a shotgun in his mouth. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
okay, like,
Well, I think with Hemingway, I think it's crazy that, like, The Sun Also Rises is literally explicitly about a man whose dick does not work.
right,
I think that, like, I think it's kind of, and also I think that, I mean, the more progressive reading of it, but I think that I still have time for it, is the idea that, he's in love with this woman named Brett who has short hair and is very sexually aggressive, whilst he has a dick that doesn't work. I mean, in
Right.
some ways, there's obviously some kind of queer reading you can probably put on that, where she's acting as a kind of masculine figure. But yeah, I think that, Berryman and Lowell, if they were all alcoholics, we know what that does. So
right, yeah,
I think that, like, looking at the dream songs through the lens of whiskey dick, I
right.
think is
Stuffing herself with
possibly.
chicken paprika, yeah, like,
Oh,
and
I
he's
was thinking about that poem a
how
few
horny
days ago.
some of those are, like how horny some of those dream songs are. Yeah,
Yeah, but it's that amazing line, which is she might as well be on Mars, which I
Yeah.
love. I was reading that poem earlier because I fancy someone at the moment, and I think that I'm in the midst of. I feel like I was relating to that poem actually, in the sense that there's a line of, "There ought to be a law against you," and it's like, what is it, Mr. Bones? There is.
yeah,
And I think that there's a sort of weird element of shame around your own desire,
yes.
which is where it's like there is actually. So I know that I'm going off on tangents,
No,
but
no.
I'm having fun. So this is
Yeah.
why. Which is, do you know the song "Ballad of a Thin Man" by Bob Dylan?
No, not as.
So that one is like, okay. I think that, again, I'm not a big Bob Dylan fan. I'm convinced that it's inspired by Dream Song 4. And I think that it's because it's called, so the chorus has Mr. Jones in it. And I think it's a kind of version of Mr. Bones, because there's literally a line that says, "There ought to be a law against you coming around." And it's this kind of desire thing.
Right.
And I've been trying to, there's that connection. I've also been wanting to really write something about, the fact that Lou Reed was really good friends with Delmore Schwartz, who was taught by John Berryman.
Right.
So I'm really trying to make some kind of tenuous Lou Reed, Velvet Underground, John Berryman connection. Did John Berryman ever listen to the Velvet Underground? Maybe. And if so, what impact did that have on the Velvet Underground? I'm so keen to kind of make that happen.
And they were all like, Dylan was reading all that poetry. Like Dylan was reading that stuff,
Yeah.
especially by the 70s when he was very much established, when dream songs and stuff were.
I mean, there's a reading that I know, because I think that he definitely would have known Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Allen Ginsberg hilariously has a song with Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen called Don't Go Home With Your Heart On, which is actually very, again, works with the virility aspect where it's like, don't go home with your heart on, it'll only drive you insane. But I think that I know Allen Ginsberg did a reading with Robert Lowell and John Berryman. I mean, who knows who went to that in New York, but I think that Allen Ginsberg opened it with saying that skunk hour, he said, oh, wait, so you're just saying that, like, you're feeling bad about being a pervert. You've been like you've been looking at these teenagers in cars and like, what?
Right.
Like, oh no, you feel sad now? You're a pervert. You should feel worse. But I think that, that entire scene was kind of like, I think that it's also interesting. I think that there's much more of a kind of interdisciplinary conversation happening at that time between music and painting. Like, something I loved is a lot of the poems in Plus Ultra were in Madrid. And I think that I used to live in Madrid. I lived in Madrid for about 7 months or 8 months. And I think that when I was there, I met, like, I think I moved there with my poet ex-boyfriend, but we knew a lot of painters and musicians. And I really felt like there was actually a genuine cross-cultural connection happening at the time. Meanwhile, in London, I don't know any painters. How would I meet them?
Right.
I don't even know any playwrights. Like, I think that there's so much segmentation that I think is generally quite unhealthy for the kind of ecosystem of the arts.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in those cities like New York and London, like these big, Madrid, like these big kind of historically, Paris, these cities where there were this historically blending of these different art forms and the art culture of the city, and you could go to these plays and you'd run into these painters and poets and or whatever. You go to the theater and you'd see all these people, or you go to a bar and they'd all be hanging out. And there's less of that overall, maybe. And I don't want to be like, oh, that's a definitive thing or whatever, but it does feel that way. Like you said, even looking for it, it's harder to find.
I think a lot of it, so there's two things. One, I feel bad because I feel like I'm actually so invigorated by the conversation. I feel like I'm talking faster than Camille Paglia.
No, please.
Because I'm enjoying it. But I think that there's two things, which is one, I just want to say one of my favorite literary anecdotes, which I think you'll appreciate, which is that, have you heard the story about when John Berryman was going to meet Yeats?
No.
Oh my God. So he writes it in a letter. He was going to meet Yeats. He planned to meet Yeats for tea, and he ended up hanging out with Dylan Thomas before. So what did they do? They get apocalyptically drunk together. Berryman is like, I met Dylan Thomas at 10 a.m. in the morning, and I'm suddenly so fucking drunk. It's 4 p.m. I can barely sit up. And he's talking to Yeats, and I think that at one point he says the only thing he can remember that Yeats said is at the end of the lunch, Yeats said, "Can I please smoke one of your cigarettes? I'm going to have it outside alone." So he just took one of Berryman's cigarettes, smoked it outside alone, and that was it. But I think that even then, I feel like that speaks towards a kind of cross-generational thing that I feel like was much more interesting, that even Berryman, Thomas, Yeats, we'd all see as being very different poetic movements, but there was still a kind of cultural exchange then. But I think to go back to, I think that you are right, and I think a lot of it has to do with what you picked up on earlier, which is that I think that there's a sort of segmentation that, again, I wonder if the MFA system rewards, but I think that also, I think I have a lot of friends who work in classical music and composing, or a few friends who work with painting, and they, like my friend who's a painter, he's like, I don't know anybody who draws.
Right.
Like within even that discipline, it's so segmented that he's like, I don't know any drawers. I only know painters.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a sort of, I don't know, I think that that's generally to the detriment of the current movement. Like, I love that they all would have been hanging out with Stravinsky.
Right. Yeah.
Which no longer happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and it's always hard. I mean, I'm never trying to get definitive answers on something where we're just chatting on a podcast, but it is interesting to just think of like, is that social media? Is that the fact that, everything's on screens? Is it the fact that, these kinds of, a magazine that would be about art and literature and literary magazines, those really can't sustain themselves anymore. They need like university endowments, they can't really sustain themselves with subscriptions and people that are interested. The big ones are grandfathered in, the New Yorker, whatever,
Well, something I'd be intrigued to ask you is that something that I find with myself, and I wonder if it's reciprocal, is that I think that when people ask what my influences are, they're obviously meaning poets. And I think that poets are obviously poetry is what I write. There's a huge amount of poetic influence, but I still actually see influences from painters or music or different disciplines for me almost as equal in terms of how they've kind of impacted what I write, or even film. I
Yeah.
think that I'm as influenced by, I don't know, The Fly by David Cronenberg or Blue
Yeah.
Velvet than
Yeah.
than I am by a poem that I really love. And I think that this idea of almost seeing influence as solely happening within this sort of specific canon, which I guess, I mean, do we blame or thank Harold Bloom for that? I think that I think there's a sort of, but I wonder whether, like, I think that for me, I feel like I write because I read Sylvia Plath as a teenager, but I also write because I got really into like Chagall as a painter and Edvard Munch as a painter, and I
Yeah.
like all these music things that also for me act as kind of equivalent influences. And I
Yes.
think that I see those all as kind of part of a similar soup that I'm taking from.
Yeah.
And I think that's almost like it'd be almost, I don't know, like finding a potato in a stew and only talking about the potato.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. That was one of my next question was, yeah, if you're 4+ Ultra, and I know this is broader, but just for your collection, to plug it here, which I already said is fantastic. It's refreshing to read
Thank
something
you.
so ambitious. It really was.
Thank you.
What inspired you while crafting this collection? And I know like that's a broad question too, but this, the themes, how did they come to be crafted or, discovered, as a lot of themes often are when you're putting together a collection, more so.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think that with Plus Ultra, what I think that it almost had to do with almost a, obviously there's a kind of emotional elements, but I think there's also almost a kind of existential angst about what poetry can and can't do. And I
Yeah.
think that there is this idea, I think of feeling quite angsty at the time, where I think that I was in a creative writing MFA essentially. And I think that there's a sense of what is the point if all the poems are I go to get a coffee and have a thought, or I get in a fight with somebody and then I have this realization. And I think that I started to feel very angsty about that. And I feel like I also was very specifically angsty about what I perceived as a kind of lack of craft that was happening, where I
Yes.
think that like this is with a lot of contemporary poets, and I don't mind saying this on record, which is like I feel like a lot of them haven't read anything older than like 50 years. And I
Yes.
think that I actually, like, I think though with a lot of them, I feel like I don't even think you like poetry.
Yeah.
I think that you like hanging out for some reason with like weird neurotics in a pub, which I sometimes also do. But I think that there's a kind of sense where it's like I actually do really like poetry. I like to read
Right.
things from any kind of era, and I
Yeah.
feel very interested in that. And I think that there's in some ways almost a, dare I say, reactionary element, where I think that with Plus Ultra as a concept, I think I was thinking a lot about Plus Ultra meaning further beyond. Again, I think I mentioned earlier the kind of concept of thinking beyond cognitive capabilities, the idea of creating new ideas through poetry. But I think also with it, there's a sort of paralyzing anxiety, which I think I can best sum up with. By my flat, there's a bit of graffiti that I think is meant to be inspirational that says, everything you think can be true. And whenever I see that, I think I have cancer. I, so I think that there's this idea of, though, if there is this kind of further beyond the edges of what we think can be possible, I think that there's an immense anxiety and an immense sense of creation. To bring it back to Berryman, actually, there's this amazing interview with him in Life magazine that was in the 60s, where he was talking about the dream songs. And I think that he said one of his biggest influences was this explorer who he was really obsessed with. And I don't remember the explorer's name, but I think that he said, to do any endeavor, you should be scared to death half the time.
Yeah.
I endeavor to always be scared to death. And I think that there's a kind of sense of creation, but also this immense sense of almost anxiety that I think is almost like you have to figure out what's behind something. And I think that that was a kind of propelling or urgent force behind that I think connects a lot of the poems thematically, which is this sort of idea of there's something beneath the surface, or you want to go beyond what you think is happening. And I think that that sort of suspicion, I think, is something that I feel like ended up being a quite kind of creative or propulsive force for me.
Yeah, I think you can definitely see that too in the writing. Absolutely. I love that. And I like when you were saying, you can see that too, because you see that in your work, particularly in Plus Ultra, the book that it's, you're pushing that kind of wild, I want to say almost, there are wild things happening, but then you're structuring it within the craft, like it's still structured. And when you were talking about, there is a lack of craft in a lot of contemporary poetry right now, and you see where people are confusing tweets with poems, or they're confusing, I think this is the political too, where it gets into the political aspect where people are obsessed with politics. It's like, well, are you obsessed with poetry or are you obsessed with politics? Because you're not doing both, Yeah, like you're doing one or the other. And you can do politics in poetry. People have done it successfully.
A great example is Adrienne Rich, I think, is someone who I think has a lot of great poems that I think managed to be political.
Right.
But I think something that I thought was really interesting is when I was doing my MFA, and I don't think that, none of them will listen to this anyway, but I don't think that anybody who's done it ended up being a writer or has done things like that. I did an MFA because I think that I knew I wanted to do a PhD. So I think that I knew that I wanted to do a PhD, and I saw it as a kind of easy stepping stone. I actually wanted to do an English, like MA, but I think that I was working at the time, and I was like, you know what? I have a lot of poems. I can do an MFA because I have all the poems there, and then I can apply for an English PhD. Anyway, I'm doing a creative writing PhD anyway. But I think that what I thought was surprising is that we had a class on prosody, and I was thinking, well, like, we're in a master's level, and none of you actually know basic prosody. I think, have you ever read, like, The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which is, I think, like, a very obscure, weird religious text?
No,
where essentially he gets obsessed with the idea of having to repeat the Lord's Prayer over and over. If he lived now, he'd be diagnosed with OCD.
Right.
But I think that he essentially gets to a point where he can, every single beat of his heart and breath is the Lord's Prayer, because he's been able to internalize it so much.
Right.
And I feel like for me, that's what I feel like I've done with iambic pentameter, where I think that I can easily go in and out of that and play with that. And I think that that for me has been really important as a writer, because then it means that I can make very meaningful decisions about how I write in terms of that way. And I think that I have something to return to. But I think that the idea of, in some ways, not even being interested in that, I think I find crazy. I think that, again, I think I do wonder a lot of what people get from poetry, because I think that, like, I personally, like, I think it's interesting. I do a lot of almost therapeutic creative writing things because I'm researching pain. So I work with pain patients and kind of do creative writing workshops about that. And that, I always say very specifically, is like, we're not creating art. We're looking at poetry as a tool to be able to kind of work with difficult emotions or express something or see things through metaphor. And that takes a lot of the pressure off. And that's great because I'm doing it in a therapeutic context. Right. But if you're trying to publish and things like that, I think that you should be wondering, I don't know, why are you doing it? Do you like, I think a lot of them I just don't think like poems.
Right. Yeah, I 100% agree. And I want to get to that in the second half. I know we're going way over here too with the time, but...
Oh, are we? So.
Well, I mean, if you have the time, I have the time. I just don't want to keep you.
I'm not doing anything tonight. So.
Perfect. Then we can just chat all night because I'm loving it.
Yeah,
this is great.
Oh, sweet. No, this is so much fun.
Good. Yeah, and I like, for some of these questions that are you've been compared. I know this is your first full length that came out, but you've been compared already to some of these reviews that I was looking up. You've been compared to Plath, Sexton, some of these giants in the field. How was that? How does that feel? Being compared to these giants. Is it daunting? Intimidating, nerve-wracking, joyous? Right? Is it like enjoyable?
So I think that when I first started writing, I think I mentioned to you my first pamphlet that came out when I was 19. I think the one thing that I really never wanted to be described as was ever confessional. And I think that I felt a lot of pressure.
Sorry, I described you that.
No, but I think that, look, 10 years later, I've gone through a synthesis with it. So I think that what I feel like I found out, though, is that I think that if you're young and a woman, and I think pretty, not that I'm saying I'm pretty, but like a little bit.
No, I think you're 100% on with this. Yeah, where I think you're going with it, at least. Yeah.
I think that there's a sort of interest in describing things in that way as sort of they must be from lived experience. And I think that often what I feel like I write with my poetry is, I think that there's a really good interview by, do you know a poet called Emily Berry?
No.
So she's a British poet, and she says that when people talk about like how she puts her experience in poems that have been described as confessional, she says it's almost like baking a cake, where if experience is the eggs, if you taste the eggs in the cake, it's been an unsuccessful cake. And that like you actually like you like they're a vital ingredient. That's obviously something that exists and you need that. But if it ends up kind of overtaking the flavor at the end, you've kind of fucked up the cake. And I think that that's kind of how I've come to view how I use kind of personal experience in poetry. And I think that especially I think that I used to kind of shy away from the sort of Plath or Sexton overtones. But I think that at the end of the day, they are some of my favorite writers, and it would be dumb for me to say them as an influence. I mean, I think that in some way, like a big boy to bring in is that I think that every writer, if you're actually serious, you should be influenced by Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to say that they're influenced by Shakespeare because that seems ballsy. But I think that actually he was one of the best poets, and I'd say I think Plath is one of the best poets.
Yeah.
So I think that I feel in some ways, if you're going to be having, I think that obviously Harold Bloom is a very controversial figure, but I think that I do relate to some of his ideas on the canon, in that I think that when I started writing, I was like, it's really exciting to be part of this kind of almost dialectical conversation that's happening through history, in which you kind of are having this massive conversation. And I think that because of that, I'm not unhappy to be compared to those people. And I think that I also then feel like I'm still working through this lineage. And I think that a lot of people, I think, see themselves as having a conversation in a very insular way, like within the past kind of 50 years, as I've kind of complained about. But I think that if you're a writer, you should be kind of like, you know what, I'm writing because I think that I'm going to coin a word, and maybe it's kind of a bit like Shakespeare, which sounds, I think, grandiose. But I think that also writing in itself, I think I thought I was intrigued by, you said earlier to me that a lot of writers are introverts, and I think that that is true. But I think that there is a healthy level of narcissism that I think is needed to be able to be like, this is worth doing something. Otherwise, quit it.
Right.
Like, I think that like if you're going to go around being embarrassed, you have to make yourself be a bit embarrassing. But I think that you have to obviously have some kind of sense of self or something to be like, this is worth me embarrassing myself over, because you have to believe in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you go over, it's this kind of, do you have confidence? Like, why are you even doing it if you don't have something to say, right? If you have to have at least enough confidence to try to say something. And that is kind of like grandiose in a way, like to have the balls to do this. But then Bloom, I think, talks about this very eloquently, but he doesn't say, having the balls, but it is kind of like having the balls to even try to compete with somebody like a Shakespeare, or like this kind of, the anxiety of influence thing where you're trying to be in there with these people. You're trying to participate in this very old art form with the greats. And you have to have a little bit of narcissism, a little bit of self-confidence, a little bit of grandiose inside you to be able to even attempt to do that, like Keats, right? Like famously was not shy about how he thought he was a genius.
Sure.
Yeah.
But is that something that I find difficult when I teach students, is that I think that a lot of creative writing programs, I think in themselves have a kind of emphasis on the writing, routine and things like that. And I think that what I was trying to almost get my students to understand was that almost a kind of, I think that we should re-romanticize inspiration as a concept, because I think that it is something that I think exists. And I think that it's something that's kind of awkward to talk about, because I think that it's something that is very difficult to teach if you don't have it. And I think that it risks coming off as mystical or elitist or things like that. But I do think that there's a very specific, what I find is that like when I'm not writing, I get very frustrated by the fact that like I don't have that kind of state that comes over me. And I think that it is something that if we're going to talk about writing poetry, is something that most poets say that they experience, and something that is worth talking about. So I think that like to tell students that I think that it's only about being able to kind of write a little bit every day, that hasn't worked for me. Like at the moment, I think that I published Plus Ultra, I think, and I hadn't written a poem for about a year and a bit. And I think suddenly I've been writing poems again, which is amazing. But I think that if I were to take a creative writing course and they'd be like, well, let's just like do a poem based off this and like just work in this way in the meantime, it probably wouldn't work for me. I think that there should be a kind of understanding of sometimes something very strange happens and the poem almost comes out fully formed. Or there's some kind of strange relationship there.
Absolutely. And I think it's, yeah, one of my questions is too, I like to ask writers when they come on here, what is your writing routine, or what do you like to do, your rituals that you get started for? And I think that, even the emphasis on routine is because, young writers don't understand that there is a lot of work involved. I think routine becomes more important when you're doing the editing processes and things, and you have to do the rewrites and stuff. But
For sure.
yeah, like there is like when you're doing these rituals, you're trying to capture that, like, yeah, that kind of headspace where you're preparing yourself to go into that inspiration, where something's just going to pour out of you that you didn't even know you were thinking about.
Yeah.
Right? And
I mean, I think
tapping into that is
in
the
some ways I
art.
think that
Yeah.
poems can be prophetic. One of my favorite stories is that I have a poem which is Cordelia in the collection, which I think is a kind of paranoid poem, which ends with a kind of vision of me confronting this girl and saying, like, she tells me what sex with my boyfriend must be like. Anyway, Cordelia is a real person. That is her real name, actually. And I met Cordelia. I'd written that horribly mean poem. I met her, I think, a year and a half later at a party, and we got on. And I was like, well, this is funny. I wrote this mean poem about you. Let me read it to you. And she said, oh, that's funny. How did you know I was having sex with him? And I said, what do you mean? I said, what do you mean? And she's like, no, I had been having sex with your boyfriend. When did you write it? She started having sex with my boyfriend 2 months after I wrote that poem. I feel like I manifested it into existence. Yeah. But I think that that's a kind of funny story. But I think that what I always say is that I feel like what makes me feel better is that I think that the process of writing happens so much before you're even just writing the poem. And I think that when I'm in down periods, which I think as a poet are kind of always difficult to kind of weather, I think that I tell myself that even what I'm reading and experiencing, these all become kind of mulch, which is kind of fertile, in which something will come out of. I mean, I think that being able to write in itself, I think becomes, I think something that I feel like a lot of, like there's, have you heard of the Sylvia Plath effect essay?
No. What is...
So it's an essay by, I think, an anthropologist, and he focuses on novelists, poets, and playwrights. And he says poets are the most likely to have severe mental health issues or try to kill themselves because they don't feel, which is great to hear, because they don't feel like they have kind of control over their art. And because they often experience it in terms of interviews as like, something has come over me, there's no sort of kind of endurance game with it. And I think that I can see how it feels like that. I mean, I feel like when I have a feeling of inspiration, it feels almost manic and it's great. But I think that what I try to kind of tell myself is that I think that all the things that happen in the in-between period, which can be very long, are kind of still part of the process of writing. And I think that you're taking things in there that are still kind of working with what will kind of ultimately happen.
I've had this, I haven't talked about it that much because it's just a theory I have where how I experience this when I'm creating, especially when you're doing longer form stuff like fiction or novel writing, where I think it's very important, and some people have touched on this, but it's like what you're filling your head with, what you're filling that kind of, for lack of a better term, subconscious with. So what you're consuming, you already said this, the music, the movies, the things that you're consuming all the time, and then what you're reading, what you're seeing on Twitter, what you're seeing when you scroll social media even, gets into that subconscious. And then that affects how you write things out. Even if you're not even thinking about them, like something you saw will start to come through, or like a feeling that you haven't even processed yet is coming through, like, anxiety about this relationship, or you don't like this girl because you can sense already before she's even fucking your boyfriend that like something's going to happen, something, she's being too flirty or she's being a little too handsy with him or whatever it is. You could just feel this and you didn't even realize you were feeling it, and it comes out in this thing like, why do I hate this girl? And it's like,
do you know a poet called Don Patterson? He's a British poet. No. You'd actually fucking love him. I think he's like the British answer to Lowell. His collection was called God's Gift to Woman, and he has this it's so good. I think that he's, again, someone who I think is kind of maligned as sexist, but I think is amazing. Right. But I think that what he does is that there's this quote of his that says, like, if there's no surprise in the writer, there's no surprise in the reader. And I think that the best poems that I write, you surprise yourself. I think that you don't know where it's going to go. And I think that, again, when I started writing that poem, I did not know that I would end with, I think she's fucking my boyfriend. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of poems where I think that what you want to do is that, like, I think this is what I often again say to my students, which is like, what happens is like you don't even need a volta, but you have to be kind of surprised or have something at stake, or there has to be something where it's like, have you ever written a poem and you're like, damn, I'm fucked up. I can't believe that I thought of that.
Yeah.
Like, how did that come into my mind? But I think that it's that sort of allowance to let yourself kind of almost feel like you're a conduit towards organizing the unconscious in this very metrical, very organized way, which again might not even come across as metrical, but considered way, I think is very, I think, powerful and very unique to poetry.
Yeah, and I think this makes me think of what you said when you work with, pain research, where you're working with people that are using poetry as a kind of coping mechanism to deal with things that they can't even process. So it's the same type of method, less artistic aim, but like you said, like it's the same type of pulling that stuff out of the head and putting it onto a page can make you realize things that you weren't even you weren't even aware of consciously. It was just in that big noggin, swimming around in that fluid, and then all of a sudden it gets birthed onto this thing, and it does.
I think that that's it. Like, I'm going to sound so pretentious here, but
please, we love pretension on this podcast.
No, I know. I think that, like, again, well, I guess Berryman, very high and low culture. I'm trying to think of the lowest culture thing I probably love is Love Island, the reality TV show. High culture thing, though, so good. High culture thing, though, is Julie Kristeva writes in The Powers of Horror, the kind of moment that you have when you see a bit of milk that has skin kind of over the top where it's kind of clotting or going off. And there's this line where it's like, when you vomit, you give birth to yourself. Yeah. And I think that in some ways, I feel like that's sometimes what like writing a poem can be like, where it's like, you look at that and I'm like, I don't even like that came from me.
Yeah.
Like, I think that I'm almost disturbed and intrigued that came from me, but I think that it's clearly had to come. I've had a compulsion, like I was nauseous before. I've been living with nausea for a year, and suddenly this is going to come out. I feel a sense of relief and disgust, and I think that that's something that kind of happens.
Absolutely. That's how it always, like it like you said, the surprise, it has to, and it feels transcendent when you're doing it. Like it does feel like you're transcending something, even if you reread it the next day and it's like, oh, this needs work, but it's still in that moment, you're tapping into that, and you use the word magic. And I know people will be cynical about that, but I think that's a romantic way to think about it, where it is this kind of, you're creating something out of nothing. And that is a huge part of the art. Yeah.
I mean, I think that honestly, like, I think it's interesting because if we think even about the history of poetry and magic, I think Yeats was massively into the Golden Dawn and the occult. One of my favorite things is that Ted Hughes was a massive astrology girly. Like, I think that now all these people who are like, wow, what time were you born so I can find out your rising sign? Ted Hughes was obsessed with birth charts. But I think that there is a sort of, again, I think that if you're going to be teaching it, especially at a university, you don't want there to be magic, because you can't really teach actual magic. You can teach tricks. Like, I can teach a lot of tricks. I can say, like, I think one of a great poem is, The Wall by Donald Justice.
No.
Holy shit, you'd love this poem. So I think that it's a poem because he was being taught under John Berryman, and it's a sonnet. And I think that he said, John Berryman said, I don't think any of you can write a perfect sonnet. And Donald Justice said, I can. And he wrote this poem, The Wall. And I think that that's, though, a great poem, but I feel like it's a magic trick. There's a sort of like, he's figured out the magic trick of the sonnet, and he can turn it around. Do I think that it's a poem that I feel there's great inspiration behind, in the way that if I read, I don't know, A Stolen Child by Yeats, or even No Second Troy? No. But it does the magic trick amazingly well. Yeah. And I think that you can teach magic tricks in a creative writing workshop, but you can't really teach magic. And I think that that's kind of some of the issue that I have with some of it, which is I think that at the end of the day, I think that I'm lucky that, again, when I was conceived, an angel came down and told my mom I was going to be a writer. I feel this sense of like, well, the magic's been there. I think that, like, which is very grandiose, but I think that people should be a bit more grandiose. I love Shelley predicting his death by drowning. I think Shelley is one of the best.
Yeah. So. And I think that there is this self-importance, especially there's always been like big-headed writers, but I think that there is that, we already said this, but that the requirement of self-confidence where, you know, you do have to think of yourself as one of the best at this in order to even be able to achieve something with it. Like there has to be that little bit of confidence. There has to be that big romantic sense of I'm doing something, even if you aren't, right? You just have to believe it. I always say, like, I make the comparison on this podcast to professional athletes or something where I know it's not the same, but just when you hear those guys talk and stuff where they're just saying like they believe that they're the best in the world at it, even if they're not, right? Like statistically or whatever, but you have to go into each game, each practice thinking I'm the best at this and I'm going to get even better today. You know, like it's that level of confidence where you wouldn't even be able to perform if you weren't thinking about it, especially at the professional level where everybody's good at this.
Yeah.
So like now how do you separate yourself, you know?
And I fucking love that. I mean, when you're talking about the professional athletes, it weirdly reminds me of T.S. Eliot, and I think it's his essay called Escape from Personality, the famous one. But I think that I love the idea that T.S. Eliot, probably one of the more boring men to have ever lived, manages to be an incredibly boring man and be like, you know what? I'm the best at this. Fuck this. I'm going to write The Wasteland and Prufrock. I actually don't like the Four Quartets, but I think I think that like to go forward and do something like that is like, I think, sick as hell. Whereas like, yeah, I mean, if I were you, I'd want to escape my personality too, but you've done it. And I think that that's awesome. I think that like, I think that there has to be a level of self-belief. Like, I think that, if we're at the end of the podcast anyway, I can like go into some of more of my hot takes.
Yes, please.
Something that I think that I don't like a lot is I think that as a Plath fan, I think that Ted Hughes was really pivotal for her being able to be as successful as she was. He really took her seriously as a poet. And he said, I think that you are really gifted and a genius. And I think that they had a relationship that meant that she was able to focus on the fact that she thought of herself as a poet. He said, published under Sylvia Plath and not Sylvia Hughes. And I think that like the entire kind of denigration of him, I think, has become a kind of annoying feminist bastardizing of what happens when two writers date.
Right.
Like, and
that's
an
interesting thing too. Like when you have, I've talked to some friends about this, not on the podcast, but when you are dating somebody who's also an artist or you're in a relationship with that, there's a conflict, and it's not just a relationship conflict. There is professional and artistic conflict, and that can be used to a benefit. That could be used to detriment. You know, a lot of those couples don't work out, right? Like,
I mean, well, like my ex, and I think I can say this because, to be honest, he's actually one of my best friends at the moment. Shout out Sam Quill. Actually, Sam Quill has an amazing pamphlet out. He's an amazing poet called "Hey Ho, the White Swan, by God, I Am That Man," and it's on Broken Sleep. If you're listening to it, I think that you honestly should get it. There's poems about me in it, and if you read my book, there's a lot of poems about him. But I think that what I found is that dating somebody who was a poet, I think that we had such an amazing competitive streak that I think at the end of the day came at the expense of the relationship. Right. And I think we are better off not romantically together. But I think that it was because I think that a lot of the romance was being like, I would put a small thing in and he'd be like, you know, I know that, like, I know what you're doing here. I know the, like, I know exactly the kind of mechanics of this. And I think that being able to have that, I think, is a bit like being under a microscope. I think that it was funny because I think that we both got to a point where we were, like, hiding some poems from each other. But I think that I wrote this, actually, the poem, there's the few poems in the pamphlet where I use his name. And I think that there is one where I think I really cruelly am talking about how he's, like, hidden mice in his jowls and his I forget what it's called, but I think that we'd as friends hung out the night before, and it was published in a big magazine in the UK, and he got a few texts from friends being like, hey, you know, your ex just published a really mean poem about you, and it uses your name. And I think that he called me and he's like, Sarah, you know, if it was a bad poem, I'd be pissed off. but it's good. But it's a good poem.
Right.
So you know what? Good for you.
Right.
I don't care. And I think that that's the sort of kind of artistic respect we had for each other, which I think actually I found really creatively nourishing.
Yeah.
But I think generally, I mean, I feel like when it comes to poets and relationships, it's Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, and everybody else has to fuck off because I think that everybody else has been a clear disaster. I think that, I mean, what does your wife do?
She's not into art at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
think that I wonder if that's
yeah.
increasingly the way. I'm single, so I'm like trying to figure out who I should date next. I'm
I've talked
obsessed
about
with
this with some friends privately, where it's just like I'm fascinated by it because then people will say, "Oh, you want to be the muse," particularly with "Oh, I want to be somebody's muse or a great artist muse," and I'm like, "Do you really? Do you really want to do that?"
You really
Because
do not.
yeah, like it's romantic, so I get the initial appeal. It's flattering, and like you said, it can even be very nourishing to your creativity to be dating somebody who is
Yeah.
also involved in this. But I think it does lead to eventually, at least my experience with it, is that it does lead to resentment. Not always, right?
Yeah.
Some people can have very successful
No,
relationships.
I think that there's a lot of competition behind it. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that I'm lucky because I think that my ex worked in a very, I think that I worked in a very high modernist fashion. I think that I was at the time really interested in Mina Loy. I mean, do you like Mina Loy? Do you know her much?
No, I'm not familiar.
So she was, I think that Ezra Pound coined the phrase logopoeia, which is the dance of the intellect amongst words about her. And I think that her and Marion Moore were kind of just two like modernist women renegades. Again, if you like Elizabeth Bishop, you'll like them. But I think that I was working in a kind of high modernist way. He did his PhD in Shelley. And so I think that he was working in a kind of much more old kind of metrical, like he was very formal as a poet. And I think that that meant that we were kind of different enough. But I think that it was interesting to see. I think that especially in the kind of poetry world, there is a sense of a popularity contest. I mean, I think that because I'd been in a relationship with another poet previously, I think I managed to make myself not massively ingratiated to the world during the breakup. And so I think that it really did make me think, though, a lot about how I think we were competitive intellectually, which I think worked, but then
Right.
also competitive in this very small microcosm of a kind of career sense, which is like, well, we both want to publish and we both are going to the same readings. And I think that we both are coming across as very different. And I think that we broke up, and I think that we're still really good friends now. But I think that for various reasons, I think if you, I think I see myself as perennially a bit of a loudmouth. So I think that I think I got myself a bit, I think I became a bit unlikable, but I think that all in good fun. But I think that it was interesting to have, I think that the tension between the fact that I think that we had a very fruitful kind of creative relationship versus the kind of nuts and bolts of having to be like, okay, we're going to this prize tonight. We have to kind of talk to this poet and seem nice to this poet. Also, have you flirted with this poet in the past? Should I
Right.
like know anything? Also, like this person might supervise my PhD, so we have to be extra nice. And I think that those things are really unromantic and tedious.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
So,
it-
wait, I
yeah.
want to ask, though, have you ever had a muse figure? Because I think that the muse is a kind of intriguing concept. I think I was joking to a friend a few days ago that I wish I could make an anthology of all the mean poems that have been written about me, because I think that I have been only a negative muse to people. I think that like there's a lot of poems that are about me, but they're like solely mean. And so I want to like have the bit of like the Sarah hate collection. Has anybody written a poem about you? And I guess what's your relationship with the muse?
Not that I know of.
I can write a poem about you.
Not that I know of. I mean, for me, no. I would say no would be my answer in terms of somebody that I would treat as that. There's definitely been obsessions. Like, there's definitely been like a woman or something that, like, throughout my life that I would be obsessed with and write things about. But no, never in that like super romantic sense that you see in movies or whatever, or.
Have you had the kind of experience that I often feel like when I have somebody who I'd see as a muse, I almost feel bad for them because I feel like it's almost like disposable.
Yeah.
the action with the act, like I feel like they're almost becoming something onto which I can kind of creatively work onto. But I feel like it's almost depersonalizing to
Right.
them, or it's like you happen to be somebody who was there at a specific time in which I'm able to kind of write or work in this way. But otherwise, like, it's not actually necessarily romantically specific.
Yeah, and it is kind of, I was talking about this in the context with a friend where we were talking about this Edith Wharton story called The Muse's Tragedy from her first collection of short stories.
Ooh, I don't
And
know it.
it's not one of her most famous stories, but it was, and it's not even like that great of a story. It's just, it was interesting to me because we were having a conversation, a week or two before I read it about this. And the story is about a woman who was married to a famous writer, poet, artist type figure, and he dies, and everyone is going to the ex-wife, the widow, and saying, oh my God, like you were his muse, you were his muse. And then she kind of by the end of the story starts to be, struggling with, did he love me or did he love
Yeah,
the art? Like, did he actually, was he
that's
using
interesting.
me? And it is kind of this, where she always felt flattered her whole life being like considered this great artist muse, but then she was thinking about it after he was gone, like, yeah, was that real? Was that just
It's
a
interesting.
selfish thing he was using me for? Or yeah,
That's fascinating. I mean, I think I don't mind saying this on the podcast, which is something that I've been starting to date someone, and I think that's something that I think that has made me continue with the sort of, I mean, I'm still like technically single in case anybody wants to hit me up. But I think that what I've realized is that the fact that I've started writing poetry again and writing poetry has made me, I feel like, attach more significance to whatever might be happening.
right,
Whether, like, I think that in other situations, that'd probably be like noping the fuck out, or like not even like there's anything to nope the fuck out of, but I think that I'd be probably approach with more caution. But the fact that suddenly, after not writing poetry, poetry is happening, that seems to me almost like some kind of cosmic sign that maybe there's something going on that I should be paying attention to. And
yeah,
I think that it's interesting as I was chatting to my flatmate about it. I'm so lucky that my flatmate is she did her master's in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. I don't even understand that shit. So she's so smart. And I think that she was saying, well, like, what's kind of interesting though is that I think that when you're talking about this, you seem very interested in what you're writing or the fact that you're writing more so than actually like the kind of what is happening. And I think that that's probably in some ways true, where I'm like, yeah, I guess if I'm writing again, I don't really want to fuck or tinker with whatever that is, but I
yeah,
don't really know why it's happening. And in some ways, like, is it necessarily personal to this person? I mean, I think obviously in some ways it is, but I think that I can so see the kind of crisis of the muse in
yeah,
which it's sort of like you are there, like at the right time. I mean, I think that I'd say if you've read Plus Ultra, I think that that's a kind of good book in not having a muse. I think the muse, if anything, is probably alcohol. So I think
yeah. I mean, that's very interesting too. And then you think about like, yeah, like because it is so intertwined, right? Like it's intertwined in your artistic life and your personal life when you're doing this, when you're putting everything into
mm,
these works of art. How can it not be intertwined with your relationships, what you're experiencing day to day and the feelings that you have. So if you're starting something and maybe there's a spark happening, and maybe it's like, and it's
mm,
still in that, like you said, kind of in between stage where it's kind of maybe could shift to that direction.
mm,
You're definitely feeling something and then it starts to come out, in the
yeah.
the work. Yeah, I
Like, a
mean,
question I'd love to ask you is, what do you think about Robert Lowell using his wife's letters in the kind of Harriet poems or the Notebook poems? Because I think that something that I feel like in my own poetry, I think that I've been criticized just from personal friends for the fact that I think that I do probably go there or at least use full name, like use a name. And I think that I actually think that Robert Lowell doing it, there's this one poem of his in the notebooks, which I love, which puts a letter, which goes, you can't carry your talent with you like a suitcase. How dare you mail us the love your life denies? Do you really know what you have done? And I think that there's some elements where I think that actually bringing that in is in the same way that you'd bring in your influence from Shakespeare or influence from something else. I think that is an added ingredient of urgency that I'm okay with. But I know that Bishop and I think also Adrian Rich really were against him using the letters in notebooks when he put it out as a collection. I think that Bishop said if you kept them as they were, that it might have even been okay, but because you changed them, you made them metrical, you made them part of the poem, they become kind of unethical to use. What are your kind of thoughts there?
It's interesting. I've never really thought about it in terms of the ethics, but it is, I do think about this because if you're going, especially with the kind of memoir, autofiction craze that kind of the literary world's been going through the last decade.
Mark Maggie Nelson.
Yeah.
That's like me. Like I've had like 3 glasses of wine now, but whatever.
Yeah, perfect.
Maggie Nelson. I find that so. I think that it's interesting because I feel like I'm writing a vague literary criticism-ish memoirish thing, but I think that the entire point is that I hate all of it throughout the entire thing. And I think that it's intriguing. Like, I don't know, have you read I Love Dick? So I think that I Love Dick is essentially Chris Kraus, who becomes obsessed with a real life man, ends up writing him insane letters, and she publishes his cease and desist letter in the novel, where he's like, stop stalking me, and she just publishes that. And in some ways, I actually have a decent amount of time for that, because I think that it's, because it's amusing and kind of trolly. I think that I wish writing in some ways was a bit more trolly. I think that we should be allowed to troll a bit more. But I think that I'm pretty, probably more so than other writers, okay with being kind of ruthless with things like that. Like I think that with the London Magazine competition where I won for the short story, I think that I'm really nervous because I think that I've spoken about it with friends of mine have read it. In my poetry, I never write about my family, but this is about my family. And I think there's some things that, again, there's nothing like horrible, but I think that it's sort of like there's a few small details. So I'm like, if my mom read that, that is actually very cruel to have published. Right. And I think it is kind of interesting at what point, like I think that Elizabeth Bishop has the line to Robert Lowell where she says, sometimes art just isn't worth that much. At what point do we think art is worth that much? Yeah,
I that is interesting. And I've thought about it more recently but I've never thought about it that hard. But yeah, it is. Where is the line? Because there's always that kind of cliche now when you ask writers, you own everything that happened to you, so it's fair game to write about. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But then it is like, yeah, do you want to put this thing in about your parents or your siblings? Do you want to, or, there are ways you can do that maybe with making it a little more hidden. Maybe there's an artistic craft to that, hiding it in there a little bit more. Using the actual words, I guess it would depend if we're talking ethically, maybe is the person okay with it? Because if you're just publishing something that wasn't meant for public consumption, that could be considered kind of a violation. Not I guess legally there'd be issues sometimes, but more personal. Well,
have you heard of the small penis clause? No. Which is that there was a legal case where I think somebody wrote a short story or something that essentially had every single thing correct about this person's life, but mentioned that they had a very small penis. And it was the sort of thing where if this person took them to court, they'd have to kind of be admitting I have an incredibly small penis.
Photographic evidence.
Yeah, it's become this sort of thing where it's like, if you put in a detail like that, nobody wants to own up to that and be like, that was actually me. So I think it is interesting. I think that especially when you use the phrase public consumption, it reminds me a lot of, I think that, again, what we kind of spoke about in the beginning about Anne Sexton. I think her weird eroticism that she has, where I think that she kind of dares you to kind of get off on her. Yeah. And I think that's something that I think is really interesting about her poetry. But I think that there's something where it's sort of like, do you want to be the person who's going to own up to that? And I think that there's a sort of almost wow, you went there sort of element that I think I find compelling, but I can see why, again, it's kind of uncomfortable. I think it's something that I generally tell myself Like, I think that what my ex said when he'd read that poem that was mean about him, I think that the last line is, Christ's sake, Sam, I want to get off. And it is about being on a train, but also having sex. So I think that he was like, Sarah, you know what? If you did it in like Poetry Review or a poetry magazine, I wouldn't mind. Why did you have to put it in like a political magazine that my friends read? So I
Right.
think that like I generally feel like it's one of those things where I feel like and poetry is not consumed by most people. People don't read much poetry, so I feel like you might as well go for that.
Yeah.
And then deal with because who's going to probably read it? Probably no one. Probably like 10 people. And so I feel like it's like if you have to deal with the like emotional repercussions from that, good luck. You've been read. That's
Right.
better than what the opposite is.
Yeah, and I guess it is, maybe it's more important to talk about in terms of cost. Because I always like to think of it in this way too, where I think a lot of non-writers or people that just enjoy, reading or whatever art, they don't see the cost of creating something. Where I think it takes something from you, like putting everything into a work of art. You look at these artists that drive them. I think, Berryman is one. I think drove himself crazy. It killed him doing this. Like he drove himself insane doing that. Joyce, I think, drove himself crazy with those last couple books, and it's just
It's so interesting.
But I mean, yeah, the
So
cost
I'm
of it.
intrigued.
Yeah.
I want to ask you why you're saying Berryman and then not Lowell, because I think
Lowell
that
too,
Berryman.
yeah.
Well, because that Lowell, I think that's something that I have a lot of time for. Is that I think that when we talk about the confessionals, I think that we really think about, and I feel bad because I feel like this podcast was meant to be about like me and my poetry, which is amazing to talk about, but like I'm so obsessed with the confessionals and I have no one to talk to about them.
Please.
But like, so I feel like with something that I find intriguing is that I feel like Plath was mad in a very specific, depressive way. I think that Lowell really had severe bipolar and I
Right.
think was hospitalized a lot, would like call himself Caligula in lessons, became delusional. And I think that Sexton as well. And I think that dealing with psychosis and things like that is a very kind of different way of being mad than simply being depressive. And I think that Berryman was an alcoholic.
Right.
And I think that those to me are kind of very different ways of almost experiencing intensity. And so I think that I'm intrigued by the sort of idea of putting something so much at stake that you die. I mean, like the most poetic death is probably Lowell when he died in the taxi holding the Lucian Freud painting of Caroline Blackwood to go make up with Harriet. I think that that's incredibly romantic and sad. But I think that what I often feel when I read a lot of Lowell is a kind of sadness. Like there's this one Lowell quote that I love, which is that it was when lithium was first discovered. And so he'd started taking lithium and he said, I'm so upset thinking about all the time I spent in asylums with psychoanalysts, thinking I was mad at my mom, but it was
Right.
really a deficiency of salt in the brain. And like the kind of almost insane existential thing that you'd feel with psychotherapy being like, actually, it's just that I have a bit of salt in my brain that doesn't work, that lithium can cure, and that I don't actually have all these things. And I feel like there's such a tragedy with that I find really, really beautiful and sad. And I think that Berryman, I think that before he died, he wrote Recovery, the novel.
Right.
I think that like, which he didn't finish. And he was a hardcore alcoholic, but I feel like that's kind of different than dealing with that sort of mindscape of, I don't know, like psychosis, I guess. I think that makes me feel very empathetic towards Lowell in a way that I might not feel towards a lot of the other confessionals.
Right. And I think, yeah, and I think you're right. There's a difference, right? There's a difference between just the creation cost where being obsessed with a piece of work and then having the alcoholism. There's a difference between that. Then there's a difference between having, like actual kind of whatever, chemical imbalances or whatever, the actual kind of bipolar mental health issues. Yeah. And that those all have different costs, just like, like the muse too. Like when you're I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a romantic sense that I'm fascinated by this too. This kind of how we romanticize artists, and we do try to we do tend to romanticize their biography and their mental state and their love life and stuff, more so than even the work a lot of times. Or we use that to help romanticize the work. I think that's fair to say.
I mean, something especially with Plath is that I feel like I've been such a Plath fan for a long time. When I read Plath, I honestly forget that she's killed herself. And when I remember that, is really actually upsetting to me. I think that it's so interesting that I feel like there's been this sort of BPD art ho reinvigoration of Plath, in which ways like she never was liked. So I think that I did a conference on Sylvia Plath, I think about ages ago, but I think that she was a type A meticulous person. She would seem like the sort of organized, popular girl who had things together. She was not a messy slut. She was not a big drinker. She was not these kind of stereotypes that we want to imbue onto her. She actually was someone who, again, was incredibly academic, obsessed with Wordsworth, obsessed with Goethe. That's what she did her dissertation on. And I think that this romanticizing of what her illness was like is so different than how she actually lived her life. And I think that I find that really frustrating. Like, I don't think that, like, there's this amazing story of Anne Sexton and Plath where they both went to the same workshop at Robert Lowell's. And I think that Anne Sexton would come late. She would take off her high heel and use it as an ashtray and start, like, smoking cigarettes into her high heel and be ballsy to Robert Lowell and be like, I don't think that's a good line. You wouldn't be happy if we did that. And Plath was the quiet, studious one. I think that there is a weird romanticizing and bastardizing of Plath. I think that's something that I love about her, is when you read Lady Lazarus, that is an incredibly, actually, it slips into iambic pentameter. Like, where is it like, I may be skin and bone, I may be Japanese, nonetheless, I'm the same identical woman. There are so many things in it that I think that are showing this kind of formal confidence that I think that really goes against this idea of her as being some kind of emotional head case that a lot of people want to relate to. And I think that it's interesting how we kind of romanticize things like that, because I think that, like, what if we want to romanticize, like, I think that we wouldn't romanticize Robert Lowell because he was genuinely, like, I think that the truth of being in hospital is, so I think that I don't mind even saying this, but, like, I think that I was hospitalized during the pandemic. And I think that it was kind of interesting because it dispelled all notions for me that mad people are somehow have good taste in music and are creative. I think that, though, it was actually really useful because I think that I was like, you know what? Mad people are the same as normal people. They don't want to listen to Jesus and the Mary Chain, and they don't want to read poetry necessarily. They're the same as everybody. And I think that it really helped me, you know, actually being like, you know what, if you're actually kind of crazy, that's obviously correlated to some things, but it does not mean that it is romantic. I think that it was the sort of like, when we were talking about smoking earlier, I think that it was like, there's nothing to do when you're in hospital except for, like, go out for cigarettes. And also that's where the cool kids go. That's where, like, the addicts go. So I'd be like, oh, hey, addicts. Like, hey, I'm in general psych, but let's have cigarettes. But I think that it is interesting how much people kind of romanticize these things. I feel like I write the best when I'm not, like, being overtaken by things. And I think most writers would say the same. I mean, I think that was it. Wordsworth or Coleridge who said emotion recollected in tranquility. I don't think tranquility is necessarily the answer, but I think that there's definitely a sense of, I think that if you are in a kind of acute state in which you're romanticizing your depression, you're really not doing anything, or even mania. And I think that I feel like Lowell made really horrible life decisions and did not write as well when he was in those states either.
I think you're 100% right, where we conflate the mental illness with the kind of grand artistic visions, where in reality somebody like Lowell was really angry that it was making his brain not work. It was making his artistic vision, you know, hurting it more than,
like, he couldn't lecture. And I think that he was someone who actually cared about lecturing. Like, he was academically minded as well. And I think that the idea that suddenly it's like, I wanted to talk about Catullus and I wanted to talk about this, and there's actually something that's keeping me from doing that, is actually a barrier between yourself and your inspiration. And I think that I find that kind of intriguing, because I think that I feel like we should be able to kind of have a vocabulary of talking about inspiration without romanticizing madness. And I think that especially, like, I feel like there's, well, you know, late in the podcast, I can get bitchy. I feel like there's some sort of a few women poets who I feel like try to kind of sell or write about a certain version of madness that I feel like is actually one, obviously, I've been going on about craft. I think that not working within craft, but I think also easily consumable and quite clean. Like I think
Yeah.
that there's this idea of, I think that people are obviously interested in like a voyeuristic idea of like girlhood and madness. Like I think that everybody loves Girl
Girl
Interrupted.
Interrupted. Yeah, I was
I
went to the exact
Dude,
same
you know what?
place.
I actually, when I was 17, I think that I went to Iowa writing workshop for like kids. And I think that we, like me and my friends, we all stayed up and watched that, and we were like, ha ha ha, so cool. And and then actually what is interesting is that with my MFA, nobody from that has ended up being a writer. Everybody from the Iowa writing workshop when we were 16 or 17, they're all writers now, and they're
Right.
all working writers. So I think that I'm still in touch with a lot of them, which is awesome. But I think that, yeah, I remember us all watching Girl Interrupted and being like, oh my gosh, are we Winona Ryder or Angelina Jolie? And we're like, wait, both are bad. We
Right.
should not want to be like any of them. But I feel like there is a sort of palatable, like what I love again about Plath is that I think that in the way in which he expresses any sorts of madness, which I don't even know if I'd use that term, is that it is formally challenging and difficult. So I think that it is going to force you to sort of reconcile with different things before it's going to actually force you to make an assessment as to a personal experience. And I think that that's what makes it interesting. I think that being crazy in itself is actually incredibly mundane. I think that like being crazy is often very boring. And I
Yeah.
think that to be able to write a poem, like I think Elm is one of my favorites, which is like, what is it like? I know the bottom she setting up on my great taproot. It is what you fear. I do not fear it. I've been there, which is in the voice of an elm tree root. What a weird ass thing to do.
Right.
Fucking crazy. That's so much more interesting to me than writing something about like, I was in the hospital and my
Right.
gown was here. And it's like, okay, cool. Well, like, I know people will buy your poems because they're going to get off on it. I think that with Plus Ultra, I feel a bit like I could have made it more get offable for people if I wanted to sell more. But I think that I'm too much of a narcissistic dickhead that I wanted it to be smart and I didn't want to deal with that.
But
So
I think it shows too, Sarah. I think it shows that you were paying attention to the things that a lot of contemporary poets do not in it, you know. And I think, you know, right now that stuff is hot, but I think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you know what's going to be remembered? It's going to be the stuff that paid attention to craft. It's not going to be this kind of, you know, tweets disguised as poems. I was going to
well,
ask you, like, one of my, I have a bunch of, like, kind of, like,
oh God.
dumb questions at the end, and then I have, like, workshop questions,
Oh no,
too.
I
like,
love this.
Yeah.
I
Instagram
don't
poetry.
have to do anything, so.
Yeah,
So
Instagram poetry. Your
I'm
thoughts
lucky that
on that?
I think that I am one much more of a tweeter than an Instagrammer, so I don't get a
Same.
lot of
Yeah.
it. I think that, dude, I know, but Twitter is like my vice. I think
It's
that
the
like
most addictive one
it's
out
the
there.
most addictive
Yeah.
one. I think that it's funny though, because my flatmate, who I kind of spoke about earlier, she gets advertised a lot of Instagram poetry, and she'll show it to me, and she's like, "Why do they think I want this?" I mean, I think that obviously, I don't know, like you're, I guess, a bit older than me, but not by much. Were you ever on Tumblr? I think that I was
I
obviously
wasn't, but I've heard a lot of this, and I think it's important, especially the people that have actually gone back, like Catherine D, some of these other writers that are like internet historian type, you know,
Oh
do it
wait,
on their
Catherine
own.
D, you know her. So
I,
that's so funny.
I think her work is so underappreciated right now in terms of what
That's so
she's
funny. So I think that
capturing. Yeah,
it's so funny that you say that because I feel like for me, she's part of an internet that I would not associate poets as being part of because I feel like I am intrigued by that part of the internet too, though. I
right.
think that like it's genuinely interesting. So I actually had a meeting with her once to talk about like growing up on Tumblr.
Right.
And I think that it is really interesting because I do feel like there's all this kind of internet mythos that becomes lost in the ether. And I think that when it comes to Instagram poetry, I think that nobody sees it as a threat. I think that it's just obviously doing tweets or things like that is different. Like, I think that one of the nicest things that my mom did is that my mom, for Christmas, she put out a PSA for the rest of the family saying, do not buy Sarah poetry books. And they were like, or if you're going to, ask me before, because I think that I've got so much like really bad Instagram poetry books as gifts. And she was like, do not buy this for her.
Right.
Just go through me if you want to buy her a poetry book, and I will probably say no. I mean, I think that I don't find it threatening. I think that what I like less than that would probably be things like the poet laureate of the US at the moment, or things like that. Like, I think that I find that sort of thing more representative of what poetry is trying to do, but in a not great way.
Right. Did you listen to my episode on that? On her?
Oh, I didn't. No, I didn't. But I imagine that we're kind of similar.
I imagine we'd have similar. I think you might appreciate it. Yeah, but it's yeah, I feel the same way. Where it's like almost there, but it's like something's missing from it. Like it's like being held back by this kind of, I call it Instagram poetry, because it's this kind of vibe of generalities, almost even cliches. Not that I'm saying that her book had cliches in it or anything, but like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think it's important. Like, it's very important right now that and I feel like not enough people, especially scholars of poetry, they're either talking about it in a resentful way because it's making sales and it's more popular than like traditional or craft-based poetry, or they're just not talking about it at all, you know? And it's kind of like, well, this
I think that it's interesting though, because I feel like there's often a kind of reactionary, oh, we don't like slam poetry thing. Right. I mean, for me, as a fan of Gerard Manley Hopkins, I feel like that's like slam poetry in some ways is working with that. And I think that I like the idea of thinking about poetry as something that is an oral tradition that's supposed to sound good. And so I like that, like, people are working within that. I think that has to do, I guess, with what sentiments are kind of being like, is, again, I guess what we've kind of permanently come back to is, are there things at stake? Or is there something kind of, like, are you trying to make a kind of political point? Or is there something kind of interesting happening here?
Or like you said earlier, it's the same type of thing where they fall victim to lack of craft, where like the idea is good, they're participating in the tradition, but then the lack of craft makes it bad, you know, or kind of not interesting, or just kind of plain and Instagram style, you know, like.
Totally.
Whereas there's something when somebody's doing a rehearsed performance of it too, that there's an intensity that you could really capture. But then if it's like mediocre,
I think that it's interesting because I feel like, well, I really love reading my own poetry.
Oh yeah.
But I think that it's interesting because I feel like there's a weird mix of, I don't really fit in with any slam scene, obviously, but slam poets seem to really like me because I think that when I perform, like, I think Caviar was edited by a slam poet, and I think that I really respect her, and she's great. And I think that she was like, when you read these poems out loud, there's an urgency. But I think that I don't really fit in there. But then in the kind of page poetry community, it's like, well, look, you don't have to look like you've been fucking shot to go on the stage. Like, why are you like, you're not, nobody's forcing you to read the poem. I've never been like, I feel like there's so much poems where it's like, you know what, like, you don't need to do this. Nobody is making you do.
Right.
I'm not like, oh, yay, time to have 20 minutes of my life towards a sniveling guy who looks like a shaved armadillo.
Yeah.
Like reading his thoughts about coffee.
Very timidly, like, kind of, oh, I'm so humble. Shucks. Oh, shucks.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I hate that shit. And then it's always something where it's like, and as I put the milk to my lips, I thought about the genocide of women in Yemen. It's like, please just stop. I hate it.
And it's like, I think it goes back to that confidence level where it's like, you have something to say because we're all here gathered to hear you say something. Put on a show. Sherman Alexie used to say this too.
Exactly.
The kind of, people can read your stuff at home by themselves in a boring monotone in their head. When they're coming to see you read it, they're coming to see you read it. Give them something.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that it's also interesting because I feel like there's very much, I think that, again, always wanted to be a rock star. I enjoy performing in general. Yeah. I think that performing is fun. And I think that it's a bit like, if I'm going to be in front of an audience, like, what am I going to do? Be fucking boring? I'm going to be interesting. I mean, also something that I feel like with Plus Ultra, which I think a lot of people don't get, is that I think a lot of it is hilarious. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, nobody wants to say that they're funny, but I think that, like, in the same way that when I read a lot of John Berryman, I'm like, this is so funny. I think that he's working on multiple different levels, and I think that being able to work within those registers is really important. Where it's
Oh
like,
yeah.
actually, this is really funny. This is actually an interesting thing. Like, I'm laughing and I'm having this. Like, even in, I think, is it the very last poem of the Dream Songs when he's talking about his heavy daughter?
Yeah.
You're like, what the fuck, dude? But it is kind of funny. Or like the one of my favorite ones is when he says like, them lady poets must not marry. And he's talking about like, and he's like, first death go, and it says something like first death like gorged on Sylvia Plath, and it's like funny, like that is
Yeah.
hilarious. But I think that you like so see when he reads something, it's like, yeah, you can see why he went up to read it.
There was
There's a
this,
point.
yeah, there was this, my first year of MFA grad school. You know, I was a first year, and then this third
Wait, so
year,
where'd you go to grad school?
I went to McNeese in
Okay, nice.
Louisiana. Yeah,
Oh my God, where in Louisiana?
Lake Charles, Louisiana.
So I don't know that. I have family from, so most of my mom's, I guess we're still recording, but I'm just acting as if we're just chatting now. So like my mom's side of the family, they're all from Montgomery, Alabama,
Okay.
and we have loads of family in Louisiana and the Florida Panhandle. So I think that I've always been wanting to go to Louisiana. I have a really romantic sense of like Baton Rouge and like,
It's fantastic, actually. If you want to romanticize the American South, go to southern Louisiana, go to Baton Rouge, Lake Charles, even New Orleans if you want to get some drinks and
I
party.
really, of course.
There's not so much a party scene in like Baton where I was. Lake Charles, it's southwest Louisiana, like 20 minutes to the Texas line.
Which poets would you party with?
Would I party with?
Yeah, which
Any of
poets?
them,
So.
really. Like the ones that like I've
No,
actually.
yeah, but you wouldn't want to party with Emily Dickinson.
I'd be down to chat with Emily. I love
Did you know
Emily.
that you could rent her a bed by the hour?
No, but I don't know if I'd do that. But I definitely the people that I would want to hang out with and like literally, even if we weren't just partying, but just to talk. Like I want to talk to. I'd love. Bloom is dead. I wish I could have gotten him on this podcast
man.
before he died. But I mean, he was so old by the time I even started. I
Man,
doubt
you know
he-
what? I
yeah.
have a mutual friend who is really good friends with Bloom's widow and has spoken to Bloom. And I think that I remember like for ages he was like, I'll put you in touch with Bloom, and I'm like, fucking do it, dickhead.
Yeah.
Like literally gun to his head. And yeah, we ran out
He
of
was
time.
so
I think-
older by that time. Like I saw some of the
know.
last interviews he did. Kind of a shell of his former self. Not his
I
fault. He
know.
was
I
like
mean,
90.
how-
Yeah,
Where
you
do you,
know.
where do you fuck with like Helen Vendler?
I love Vendler.
I
Absolutely
love
love
Vendler
Vendler.
as well. I think Vendler's amazing.
I think
So,
she's one of the last great like critics and serious scholars of the poetry too.
completely agree.
And yeah, absolutely love. I would definitely want to be that. Yeah, Dickinson. I've been Berryman. Hell yeah, I'd want to be
I
talking
mean,
with.
Berryman would be so fucking fun. I
Yeah.
think that Lowell would be fun. You know that Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop used to smoke hella weed together?
I would love that. That
I
would
mean,
be.
I think that it's kind of funny because I think that I'm so much not a stoner. I think that I'm like, I think that that's actually a massive difference between the UK and the US, which is that all Americans I know, just because it's legal, they like smoke hella weed.
Oh yeah.
None of my friends smoke weed. I don't smoke weed. But like, and whenever I smoke weed, I get like, I feel like I think too much about line breaks. So it's like not good. But yeah, I love the idea though of Bishop and like Lowell getting high together. I love the idea. Like, I think that, you know, problems aside, Ezra Pound was on hella stims in the
Right.
pandemic, like when he was like stuck in like the hospital of St. Elizabeth. And I feel like it'd be like Ezra Pound managed to convince the psychiatrist at St. Elizabeth that he needed to have sex twice a week as part of his treatment. How could, like, what a Chad move. That's so
Yeah.
funny. Like,
Unbelievable.
I'd love to party with Ezra Pound.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, and there's, I mean, you could name all these people. I guess maybe some of them wouldn't even be that fun. Everyone's like, oh, let's do Hemingway. I was like, would even drinking with Hemingway be that much fun? I don't know.
No.
Yeah.
Wait, what's he gonna do? Talk about like his dad?
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
you ever been with that person where you're like, oh, maybe they're interesting, and then it's like suddenly like 4 trauma stories later, and it's like not vibing with it.
The trauma obsession too with
Oh my God.
kind of the romanticizing artists and this kind of latching on to little pieces of trauma and saying, oh, this is why they did something, you know, like I always have a hard time with that, but
I think that there's a sort of fetishizing of trauma.
yeah.
Although I want to go into this, but actually I have to pee again. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, sure, please.
So amazing. So yeah, I think the fetishizing of trauma though is intriguing to me because I think that there's a sort of almost impetus, I think, for a lot of writers. I think that that's the most interesting thing about them. And I think but I think that that's something that I feel like is such a net negative to
Yeah.
the kind of artistic ecosystem in which it's like, well, I don't know. Have you ever thought that like your thoughts are the most interesting thing about you, or there's multiple different things that are kind of working in your favor? I think that the kind of almost fetishizing of disclosure is
Yeah.
something that I really don't like.
Yeah, and I think that it's so important to point that out. The difference between confessing and then the disclosure, the fetishizing disclosure, the kind of, there's almost a selfish way you can confess. And I'm fascinated this in terms of like an artistic point of view, but also just the, living life, philosophical point of view, especially in the internet age where people confess, but it's for selfish reasons. Usually, they're not doing it to absolve themselves of something. They're doing it to get attention. They're doing it to make themselves seem quirky or unique or like a,
Yeah.
BPD
Well,
arco, like,
Well, no,
Yeah.
but the idea of like clout as something
Yeah.
that you can somehow get from like, I think that something that I find frustrating is that there's a lot of artists where I'm like, I don't know, for me, like the most interesting things about me are not terrible things that have happened to me. And I think that
Right.
like if you wanted to play those games, like I don't want to play that game. I just
Yeah.
choose to kind of dissolve myself from that game because I think that ultimately, I think that it's interesting. I feel like, I guess there's a kind of crisis of identity happening
Yeah.
and people want to kind of put their identity onto something. But I think that it's something that will ultimately be a very fruitless way of kind of putting your identity onto something. Like, I think it's not going to ultimately give you much meaning and it won't give the world much meaning. I think that it's kind of artistically fruitless.
Yeah. And for me personally, it's like, I always say, like, when people ask me, oh, do you have any traumas? I'm like, no, I had an idyllic childhood. It was perfect. I wouldn't change anything about it. I really, sure, I had, your basic teenage struggles and all that
Well,
kind of
this is
stuff.
the thing,
But
which is, I feel like the
yeah.
definition of trauma has been very expanded.
Yeah. Like the most
And I
traumatic
think
thing
that,
that
like,
happened to me was I was like a fat kid. Like, and people
yeah,
would
like,
make fun of
but
me,
like
but
that's
that
it
was
where I'm
it.
like,
Like,
I was bullied and weird because I'm a weird person. And I think that ultimately, like, I think that there's things where it's like I could see that as being traumatic, but ultimately I think that I am much happier as a person
right.
to see myself as kind of, I'm not emotionally consistently that like weird girl who listens to Hole. I mean, I'm still now a weird girl who listens to Hole, but I think that ultimately like you kind of move past that. So I think that that's something that I feel like there's a sort of,
It could trap
I
you.
don't feel like
Yeah.
that gives me any creative currency. And I feel like for me at the end of the day, as much as I'm a kind of expressive and emotional person, I think that I'm very interested in craft and what is going to kind of help my life get into the point in which I can kind of create the best art. And I think that I do not think that perpetually seeing myself in those kind of terms is going to be useful at all.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point about it being like you can get trapped in it. So if you're tapping your traumas for inspiration as opposed to, your own ideas or something, or like your own thoughts or these kind of, you can get stuck in that. So then when you do get into a better headspace and you're not feeling as depressed or whatever, well, then you feel like you're not doing as good a work, or, you kind of fall into that trap of repeating yourself because as a creator, as an artist, where people are constantly trying to evolve and change and do something different and keep ourselves interested, because it starts to get boring if you're doing the same stuff. You can trap yourself into being like, oh, I wrote about all my traumas, so now I have nothing else to write
exactly.
about. Yeah, and it's like, well, no, you can write about your non-traumatic stuff. You can write about whatever.
Exactly. And it's like almost like take yourself seriously in terms of you being a person who's like kind of imbibed your influences and done all of this. See yourself as a kind of serious creator. You can exist beyond your own immediate experience. And also, like, for me, I was chatting to a friend about this recently where, there's this Randall Jarrell poem, which is called, like, North something, but it says something at the end where it's like, I learned that, like, the knowledge that I gleaned from pain, like it was not knowledge, it was only pain.
Right.
I think that I have as much to learn from pleasure as I do from pain. And I think that pain itself is not the only kind of exploratory physical feeling that you can have to expand your mind. And I think that we have to stop kind of fetishizing this idea of just pain as what we want.
Yeah, and that's from the PhD researcher, the researching pain too. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! In it,
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.